To start off, this is not a friendly video. Finnbol's first video on the Moscow trials has garnered 90,000 views on YouTube. It has gone unrefuted for 7 years, likely because no self-respecting person would waste hours of their time with it. However, I've decided to be the one to do such a thing, because if I don't, who will? You might be saying, his video is 7 years old, why are we responding to it now? Well, mainly because as I browse the web, I still see people, young impressionable communists, citing it as if it is a good source. All in the comments of his video, and all over Reddit, I see people congratulating him for how well researched the video was, and it genuinely bothered me that no one saw what was wrong with the first 2 videos that he put out. This video is going to have 2 sections. The first half is a response specifically to his first video, The Moscow Trials, Part 1, The Investigation. In this first part, I'm going to respond to some of the claims that he makes, the history that he presents, and demonstrate some of the issues that I have with his sources as well as how he uses them. The way he uses and interprets his evidence kind of irks me, and I'm not even going to get into every example, just the ones that I found the most egregious. His video on the trials is more political and ideological than it is historical, and that's a problem because it interferes with his methodology. All of Finnbol's quote-unquote connections between Trotsky and fascism are red herrings and don't concern me. What I'm worried about is the trials. In the second portion of the video, I will demonstrate why people thought that the trials were fraudulent, and that it's not because of bourgeois propaganda, but the Soviets themselves who made it apparent. Finnbol swears up and down that there weren't any contradictions in the evidence and that nothing in the trials were absurd. But when he quotes the court transcripts, he only does so when he's quoting Radek, Zinoviev, or someone else when they implicate Trotsky in the conspiracy. Somehow, in all of his videos, he barely talks about the trials, but brings up secondary evidence to prove that a conspiracy did in fact take place. I'm going to be talking about the trials themselves, and this second part is less my analysis and instead will be mostly me reading from my sources, which went over the court transcripts and noticed all the contradictions that Finnbol says aren't there. My sources demonstrate rather well what the issues were, especially since some were contemporary pieces. I also talk about his second video and his last video, for he claims that the trials had observers who felt that the trials were fair. On the observers, I'm going to dedicate a whole portion. If you are more interested in getting to the point as to seeing why the trials were fraudulent, I would recommend skipping the first half because I'm mostly attacking Finnbol's methodology more than anything. I'll post some clips from his first video, and I'll also be using screenshots of the transcript of the text which he published on his website. I'll admit that I did not watch the third video, and I'm not going to talk about it, only his first, second, and fourth. Once more, my only care is the trials themselves, and not the Great Purge, so it didn't concern me. And I also say this for anybody who supports Finnbol who comes through to this video. I must say, if you care about proper research, and if you consider yourself to be a communist, I would ask of you to engage with my work and to not immediately engage in name-calling. I am not a Trotskyist, so don't even think about calling me one. And if you want to hear how I feel about the accused, personally, I don't even care that a lot of them died. I legitimately, with all my heart, don't care. Most of them, especially Karl Radek, were a bunch of opportunists with no principle. One of the only ones that I do have any respect for is that thug Ryutin, because unlike those others, he didn't allow himself to perform like a monkey for these games. Even though his so-called terrorist text was used as major evidence in the trials, he was not present at any of them. In fact, he was executed just a couple weeks before the second trial even took place, because he refused to confess. The reason I take an interest in this case is because for the same reason I came around to supporting Marxism in the first place. That is, I don't like being lied to. So then, my friends, let's get into the video.
Background 1927 to 1928. Party debates and factional struggles. In the 10th Party Congress, Lenin had proposed a ban on factional groupings inside the party, as they went against the organizing principles of Bolshevism, democratic centralism. Democratic centralism means that on any given topic, everyone has freedom of speech to express their opinion, but once a decision is reached, everyone must uphold the rule of the majority. If, after having lost a debate on any given issue, a factional grouping still continued to insist on their own policy, despite the party majority deciding against it, they would probably be expelled from the party. Either accept the party's principles, or be expelled. Quote, "In the practical struggle against factionalism, every organization of the party must take strict measures to prevent all factional actions. ensure strict discipline within the party and in all Soviet work, and to secure maximum unanimity in eliminating all factionalism. Lenin, summing up speech on party unity and the anarcho-syndicalist deviation. Lenin's ban on factions led to the suppression of various kinds of factional activities from the syndicalists, Trotskyists, the left communist faction led by Bukharin, and other groups. These groupings were forced to accept democratic centralism and party discipline if they wanted to stay in the party. We move forward to 1927, when Stalin has outmaneuvered his opponents. His policies are being accepted, he is recognized as the rightful leader of the party, and the majority backs him. Trotsky's left opposition has been ideologically defeated. Zinoviev and Kamenev, who previously had been going back and forth about supporting Trotsky, make an alliance of convenience with him and his supporters. This group becomes known as the United Opposition. An opposition grouping is tolerated within the party for a while, but in October 1927, the United Opposition stages a demonstration, separate from the rest of the Bolshevik party, officially to commemorate the revolution, but also to criticize the political line of the party majority and the Central Committee led by Stalin. This is recognized as factionalism by the party, and many members of the United Opposition are forced to self-criticize or be expelled. Zinoviev and Kamenev capitulate and are allowed to stay. Trotsky refuses and is expelled. He is deported from the country a year later. In exile, Trotsky begins to write books and articles against the Soviet Union's current leadership. He accuses the Soviet government of various wrongdoings and claims that he himself should have become the leader.
Not even 1 minute into the video and we are already falsifying history. Finnbol is already trying to set up a narrative to make Trotsky as well as Bukharin look as though they were guilty by bringing up the ban on factions, by stating that, quote, Lenin's ban on factions led to the suppression of various kinds of factional activities from the syndicalists, Trotskyists, and the left communist faction led by Bukharin and other groups. Firstly, when the ban on factions was initiated, its purpose was to clamp down on that supposed anarcho-syndicalist deviation. It specifically mentioned in the ban. The faction ban was specifically targeted at two groups, the workers' opposition and the democratic centralists. Though, when Finnbol says syndicalists, he does mean the workers' opposition, but he doesn't explicitly say that, and I think that he should have. By 1921, Bukharin was not a left communist, far from it, and the left communist faction as a whole had ceased to exist. What you did have was the left communist group, the democratic centralists, which did in fact end their existence in submission to party discipline when the ban on factions was announced. And later, there was Myasnikov's worker group, which was kicked out for factionalist activities. Finnbol talks about so-called Trotskyists, but who are we talking about? Did these Trotskyists form a specific group, one which constituted a faction like the workers' opposition? During the trade union debate, Trotsky had supporters, one of which was Bukharin, who cannot be called a Trotskyist by any means. Support for an opposing platform during a debate can't be called factionalism. The reason that the workers' opposition was considered a faction was because of Kollontái's book, with that harshly criticized Soviet policy, in which Lenin interpreted as creating an alternative program to the official party platform. When the factionalism issue came up, who was it that Lenin was speaking harshly about? Not Trotsky. It was Kollontai and Shliapnikov who he was denouncing and raging at. Lenin quite literally threatened to shoot Kollontai. After the Kronstadt incident and after the ban on factions, Kollontai and Shliapnikov had a fall from grace. But Trotsky was still riding high, so it's obvious this issue had little effect on him or Bukharin. Bukharin and Trotsky had very little to do with this event, and Finnbol only brings them up so you can already have the idea in your mind that they are going against the interests of the party, and therefore are likely to be guilty for their alleged crimes. After mentioning this ban on factions in 1921, Finnbol jumps 6 years into the future to mention Trotsky's removal from the party, which conveniently ignores 6 years of not just party history, but world history. Now, I personally feel that you can't begin discussing the Moscow trials without first analyzing Soviet domestic and foreign policy from the standpoint of a revolutionary in the 1920s. In fact, in order to discuss the Moscow trials, you cannot start in 1926. You have to go back all the way to 1917, when the February Revolution erupts and the Bolsheviks embark on their path to power. You have to understand how the mechanism of party rule first developed, that is, the transformation of the Bolshevik Party from an underground and revolutionary vanguard party into a ruling party that has intertwined itself with state functions and operates the new state machinery erected post-revolution. you must also be knowledgeable and engaged with the political charades which were already ongoing as early as 1920. For example, we are told of an opposition, but what exactly are these people opposing? This is highly important for the development of this case, as well as for its background. I do not subscribe to the typical Trotskyist fantasy that Mr. Dadovich was waging some sort of heroic struggle against Stalin. This narrative of Trotsky versus Stalin is repeated ad nauseum, especially in dramatic bourgeois retellings of the story, but it is an oversimplification of the events which occurred. If Trotsky truly found an enemy in the Soviet leadership in the 1920s, it was not Stalin, but Bukharin. From the initial elaboration of Bukharin's program in 1924 to 1926, through its revision in 1926 to 1927, Stalin was a Bukharinist in economic policy. With those policies under fierce attack at the 14th Congress in 1925, he declared, "We stand, and we shall stand for Bukharin." Of this, the opposition had no doubt, said Kamenev at the same Congress. "I now see, comrades, that Comrade Stalin has become a total prisoner of this political line, the creator and genuine representative of which is Comrade Bukharin." I think Cohen's statement that Stalin was a Bukharinist is an exaggeration. Alan Ball demonstrates that Stalin wasn't principally a supporter of the NEP in the same way that Bukharin was. However, what this does show is that Trotsky's principal enemy, like most of the left, and in fact a majority of the Bolshevik party, was the kulak, the rich peasant who ostensibly gained the most from the revolution and was now gaining from the NEP. Trotsky's primary enemy was the person he felt represented this class with his policies, Nikolai Bukharin. It was Bukharin who the Bolshevik left despised and hated. It was Bukharin which they identified with counter-revolution. Thus, when Stalin made a tactical alliance with Bukharin, they identified Stalin also with counter-revolution. It was Bukharin who aided in the concocting of the theory of socialism in one country. It was Bukharin who at times defended so-called kulaks, and it was Bukharin who was the official theorist of Bolshevism, and who had been so since at least the early 20s, and by 1926, it was Stalin who was enabling him and actively working with him in his war against the left of the party. The issue, therefore, was not Stalin or his program. He had no program. He was supporting Bukharin's. The problem that the left had was the direction that Stalin was going. This is why, for example, when Stalin made his left turn, so many so-called Trotskyists hopped ship, as John Eric Moreau writes. Like Trotsky, Cliff sharply condemns the successive waves of Trotskyist capitulators to the Stalin regime over a period of roughly 5 years, beginning with E. Preobrazhensky and 400 others, and concluding with the surrender of Christian Rakovsky, the last authoritative Trotskyist leader in the Soviet Union, in March of 1934. The hour of their capitulation is the gauge of their moral courage, according to Trotsky and Cliff. The earlier the surrender, the less steadfast; the later, the more intransigent. Trotsky, of course, never surrendered, because his moral courage and intransigence had no bounds. Nevertheless, Cliff's moralizing criticism is misplaced and misleading, because it bears little relation to the clearly stated political reasons given by Trotsky's followers to break with Trotsky, go their own way, and rally to Stalin. The left oppositionists pledged allegiance to Stalin's policies, not out of lack of moral courage, but precisely out of the courage of their political convictions. The specific date of their capitulation marks the point in time at which certain leaders decided Stalin's policies of collectivization and industrialization had become irreversible. In retrospect, we may say the sooner these leaders rallied to Stalin, the more farsightedness they displayed. Indeed, as early as May 1928, Preobrazhensky had personally written to Trotsky that Stalin and the majority of the party were finding a way back to Leninist politics and showing their iron determination to build socialism by beginning to undertake a resolute struggle against the Bukharinist right wing of the party, and through them, pro-capitalist kulaks in the countryside. Stalin, Preobrazhensky insisted, was not maneuvering merely for short-term political gains. No, he was fully committed to socialist construction. Many left oppositionists initially rejected Preobrazhensky's pro-Stalin orientation. They did not share Preobrazhensky's appraisal of Stalin's determination to stay the course. They cautioned it was too early to join Stalin. However, as it became progressively clear that Stalin's policy was a strategy for the long haul, more left oppositionists rallied to Preobrazhensky. The end came in July 1929, when he, Radek, Smilga, and 400 other left oppositionists crossed the Rubicon and publicly declared their solidarity with Stalin, justifying their break with Trotsky, their de facto leader and spokesperson. This huge swathe of the left opposition leadership declared, plainly and directly, "We believe the policy of industrialization of the country translated into the concrete figures of the 5-year plan is the program for the construction of socialism and the consolidation of the class position of the proletariat. we believe it to be our Bolshevik duty to take an active part in the struggle for the implementation of the plan. As Stalin began to advocate positions that were eerily similar to the left's, Trotsky, falsely believing that Bukharin had much more control than he actually did, argued that Bukharin was going to hunt down Stalin as a Trotskyist, and Bukharin did on several occasions call Stalin a neo-Trotskyist. Even when Bukharin finally discovered in the late 1920s that, quote, the disagreements between us and Stalin are many times more serious than all the disagreements we had with you, Trotsky disagreed. As Cohen writes, Trotsky was convinced that Bukharin was the avatar of the Thermidor. He went as far to write down, with Stalin against Bukharin, yes. With Bukharin against Stalin, never. With Stalin, yes. With Bukharin, never. What more needs to be said about Trotsky's stance at this time? When the opportunists Zinoviev and Kamenev were put to death, Trotsky wrote critically of them, but still in their defense. When Bukharin and Rykov were executed, Trotsky left no words for either of them. Finnbol speaks of democratic centralism, but he doesn't truly talk about the structure of the party and the intricacies involved in the operation of party decisions and how they played out. For one, he speaks of the party supporting Stalin's policies in 1927. If by Stalin's he means Bukharin's, then he's right. He mentions that Zinoviev made alliances of convenience with Trotsky. By this, he means to imply that they are opportunistic. He is correct. But it is hypocritical to imply that Stalin did not himself make alliances of convenience either. What else could Stalin's alliance with Bukharin have been? By joining with Bukharin, Stalin reconstructed a Politburo majority of 4, with Trotsky temporarily in sullen abstention, against his former allies Zinoviev and Kamenev. In turn, Bukharin secured an official majority for those policies in which he fervently believed. In the terminology of the 20s, Bloc best describes the Politburo majority led by Stalin and Bukharin. It was a conditional alliance of convenience between different groupings, not a single group of wholly like-minded oligarchs. The Bolshevik Party was anything but democratic. Control over the party and the state was a battleground which the Sons of October waged their own civil war over between 1923 to 1928. Control over distinct positions in the Soviet apparatus, such as Rabkrin, the Secretariat, or Orgbureau, or Pravda, gave distinct advantages not afforded to other members of the party. For example, to quote Cohen once more, control over the Central Committee's 2 principal organs of opinion gave Bukharin an important weapon in the factional struggle, as evidenced by Zinoviev's futile campaign to establish rival publications in Leningrad in 1925, and by Stalin's all-out effort to take them from Bukharin in 1928. Through Pravda and Bolshevik, Bukharin reigned over a far-flung press and propaganda empire, both published under their auspices a variety of other widely circulated periodicals, newspapers, and pamphlets, while Bukharin sat also on the editorial boards of numerous other journals, encyclopedias, and publishing houses. Most important politically, the local party press took its editorial lead and often its articles directly from Pravda. Even aside from these distinct advantages held by the upper echelons of the party, lower-level dissidents repeatedly complained about the lack of ability for them to speak their views. I had a section in this video where I was talking about the struggle of Sapronov and Smirnov to even get their platform published, but I'm just going to cut it out.
Trotskyist conspiracy. Illegal Bolshevik-Leninist underground inside the USSR, 1932. Quote, one fights repression by means of anonymity and conspiracy. Letter from Trotsky to Sedov. The opposition led by Trotsky would eventually be accused of treason, espionage, and running an illegal anti-Soviet underground organization inside the USSR in the Moscow trials. The opposition bloc of Trotskyists, turns out, was entirely real, not a Stalinist invention. It was then discovered that the Harvard Trotsky archive had been purged. Items had been removed. This was a closed archive, meaning that only certain Trotskyist researchers had been previously given access, mainly Isaac Deutscher, who wrote a massive biography on Trotsky's life. Trotsky's wife had also been given access. They formed the most obvious candidates for the censoring of the archive of sensitive materials. Quote, the proposal for a bloc seems to me completely acceptable. Letter from Trotsky to Sedov. Quote, the bloc is organized. It includes the Zinovievists, the Sten Laminazi group, and the Trotskyists, former capitulators. The Safar Tarkan group have not yet formally entered. They have too extreme a position. They will enter very soon. Letter from Sedov to Trotsky. Quote, As far as the illegal organization of the Bolshevik Leninists inside the USSR is concerned, only the first steps have been taken towards its reorganization. Trotsky, December 16, 1932. Bolshevik Leninist was a term used by Trotsky for his own supporters, Trotskyists. Brouet's findings were published in his book, The Bloc of the Opposition Against Stalin. Despite the fact that this was a truly bombshell revelation, these findings were not given much attention. Many Trotskyists deny the existence of the Bloc to this very day. Mainstream historians also largely continue to imply that the Bloc was Stalin's invention and fabricated. The discovery did spark interest in the new school of Soviet studies among historians like J.R. Getty, who also visited the Trotsky archive and came to the conclusion that it had been censored. But if the materials left in the archive proved at least part of the allegations at the Moscow trial, what about the missing materials? Trotsky, his son, and his secretary vehemently denied the existence of the Bloc, claiming it to be a Stalinist lie. Trotsky's secretary never mentioned it in his memoirs written well after Trotsky's death. Same goes for perhaps Trotsky's biggest advocate, Isaac Deutscher, who was allowed to go through the archives, yet continued to insist there was no secret underground organization, or Bloc. This is what they said publicly. Quote, "Of course the Russian Bolshevik Leninists didn't enter into any kind of Bloc." Sedov, The Red Book. While this was what they said amongst themselves secretly. Quote, "The proposal for a Bloc seems to me completely acceptable." Letter from Trotsky to Sedov. "The Bloc is organized." Letter from Sedov to Trotsky. Naturally, anyone will profess innocence. Quote, "The indictment dates the conclusion of the Bloc in 1932 as the starting point of the terrorist activity of the accused. From their side, Trotsky and Sedov denied the Bloc even existed." Pierre Brouet, The Bloc of the Opposition Against Stalin. Quote, "It is clear then that Trotsky did have a clandestine organization inside the USSR in this period, and that he maintained communication with it. It is equally clear that a united oppositional bloc was formed in 1932. Getty, Origins of the Great Purges. Political assassinations. Murder of Sergei Kirov, 1934. Quote, "Stalin must be killed," Leon Sedov. Quote, "Stalin is crushing the country. Implacable hatred is accumulating around him, and a terrible vengeance hangs over his head. An assassination attempt? It is possible that this regime will ultimately suffer individual terror. One can add that it would be contrary to the laws of history that the gangsters in power not be subjected to acts of vengeance." Leon Trotsky.
Now let's discuss this bloc of opposition that Finnbol speaks of. The bloc existed, no doubt. Trotsky admitted to it, but what does this mean exactly? In Finnbol's video, he tries to prove that this bloc was indeed a terrorist organization, but it is not convincing. In any situation that you have terrorists, you usually have evidence. You have more than just a paper trail, but you also have the activities which they took part in. The bloc, as far as I am aware, was purely political. Even your source, Arch Getty, believes that the bloc was of a political character. It was not ready to engage in terrorist activities. You say that Trotsky lied about the bloc's existence, but, I mean, if we're being honest, why would he be truthful? Who openly admits that they are operating a secret political resistance? Finnbol, I hope for your comrades' sake that you never get arrested, because it sounds like if you do, then they're all going to get snitched on. For the rest of the video, Finnbol is going to call Trotsky a liar, but what revolutionary tells the truth? The thing about this 1932 bloc is that it should have been discovered in 1932 when the two main leaders, Ryutin and Smirnov, were arrested and sent into exile. The letters that Arch Getty speaks of talk about Zinoviev-ist, but not Zinoviev and Kamenev proper. So the letters do not exactly confirm that Kamenev and Zinoviev were part of the bloc. But either way, they were arrested again in 1932 following the Ryutin affair. Thus, in 1932, this bloc should have been discovered, yet it wasn't, and somehow the terrorists were still able to remain underground for 2 more years? There's already a lot of suspiciousness around the fact that it took the terrorists 2 years to enact their plot. But once you see, when I read the court transcripts, you're going to see even further how ridiculous some of the things they were accused of are. For Finnbol's quote, "Stalin must be killed," he doesn't provide a source. I figured that it may have been a letter between Sedov and Trotsky, but I've yet to find it anywhere. It's not even in his bibliography, and he doesn't use any footnotes on his website. The quote, "Stalin must be removed," however, is written in Sedov's Red Book. Our next unsourced quote reads as follows: "Stalin is crushing the country. Implacable hatred is accumulating around him, and a terrible vengeance hangs over his head. An assassination attempt? It is possible that his regime will ultimately suffer individual terror. One can add that it will be contrary to the laws of history that the gangsters in power not be subject to the acts of vengeance." And that is a verbatim quote. The word implacable is misspelled. This quote also has no source, but is attributed to Trotsky. When I look it up, I am taken to Finnbol's blog instead. This happens twice actually. Later in the video, Finnbol makes these absurd claims that Trotsky supported and still support the OUN and the UPA. Throughout most of the video, when Finnbol uses quotes, he says the name of the author and the source where he acquires his quotes from. But these quotes, they are unsourced. On his blog in the comments section, when someone asks where he got the quotes from, he says that it comes from a Trotskyist magazine called Revolutionary History. This magazine was published from 1988 to 2015. However, he still doesn't cite the specific document in his blog, or state which edition of Revolutionary History he got his quote from. In the comments section, he says this: neither in his video nor in the description does he actually say where he got his quote from, nor does he say who he's actually quoting. It is not just implied, but directly stated that the Trotskyist movement during World War II supported the OUN. It's already hard enough for me to believe something this ridiculous, because who in 1941 that didn't live in Ukraine ever heard of the OUN or the UPA? The average person was likely not familiar with any Eastern European fascist organization, least of all one as friends as the OUN. Even today, with the internet, most people don't know about these organizations, which is why they mistakenly repeat the fascist slogan, Slava Ukraini. Finnbol says that it is because of the writings of Trotsky that Trotskyists are influenced to support fascists for simply being anti-Soviet. But apparently, per Finnbol's own admission, it is not the Trotskyists who support and make attempts to rehabilitate the OUN and the UPA, but a Ukrainian nationalist organization called the URDP. I am to take this as evidence that the Trotskyists supported Ukrainian fascists during World War II, and that today they try to rehabilitate them? When I looked up Trotsky, Bandera, these were the results that I got. Furthermore, is it not malicious to use the statements of one group as an indictment of a whole movement? Let me provide an example. During the Cold War and following the Sino-Soviet split, once Brezhnev came to power in the Soviet Union, Mao openly stated that the USSR had become a fascist state of the Hitlerite type. He also began speaking of resisting Soviet social imperialism. With Mao's words behind them, the whole Maoist movement began to actively oppose Soviet foreign policy in the same manner which Finnbol alleges that the Trotskyists had in the 1930s. The difference, however, is that with the Maoists in the 70s, it got to such a point that one such group, the October League, notoriously came to support the Shah of Iran as an imperialist bulwark against the Soviet Union. The Shah of Iran. And try as much as you want to disconnect the October League, which later called itself the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, from your movement, but one of your darlings, Harry Haywood, the Black Bolshevik as they call him, served on its central committee when the group came about in the 1970s. Certainly, you will say, not all Marxist-Leninists, and you are correct, but yet, as your own logic dictates, it is the writings of Stalin and Mao that influence these people to support the Shah. There are many slanders that you can levy at the Trotskyists, such as the fact that the World Socialist website supports Roman Polanski, but this one that you repeatedly insist on is ridiculous, and it is a hill you've been dying on for almost a century. Say what you will about the Trotskyists, but from the ranks of Trotskyism, we've received C.L.R. James, Andreu Nin, Henk Sneevliet, and Tatu Tao, all splendid revolutionaries, all of which, except Tao, broke with Trotskyism during their lifetimes. All of them were people much more deserving of the title Bolshevik than you ever will be.
Alexander Zinoviev, no relation to Grigori Zinoviev, was a political dissident in the USSR and was eventually exiled from the country. In 1939, he was accused of a plot to murder Stalin as part of an underground organization, but was eventually released. He spoke of those years after the fall of the Soviet Union, actually admitting to his guilt. Quote, "I was already a confirmed anti-Stalinist at the age of 17. The idea of killing Stalin filled my thoughts and feelings. We studied the technical possibilities of an attack. We even practiced. If they had condemned me to death in 1939, their decision would have been just. I had made up a plan to kill Stalin. Wasn't that a crime? When Stalin was still alive, I saw things differently. Until Stalin's death, I was an anti-Stalinist." Alexander Zinoviev, The Remorse of a Dissident. The fact that he was arrested by the NKVD but released due to lack of conclusive evidence or confession argues against the idea that the oppositionists were merely framed by the Soviet government. Not only was Alexander Zinoviev released and therefore not framed, but he also admits his guilt, being an unwitting part of an underground group. This seems to demonstrate that the investigation was fair. The accused was innocent until proven guilty. Clearly, the notion of political assassinations was not invented by Stalin. Alexander Zinoviev admits his guilt. He wasn't tortured into confessing by the NKVD. The NKVD doesn't even exist anymore.
We come to a major red herring with the likes of Alexander Zinoviev, whose story is convenient, as he admits to his anti-Stalin tendencies, and as having tried to kill Stalin. The problem, however, is that Finnbol accepts his story at face value, and tries to compare this lone dissident, who was very young at the time, and who only came up with a plot to kill Stalin, but had not ever actually carried it out, with the likes of Stalin's disgraced political opponents. First of all, when Alexander Zinoviev was arrested in 1939, he was only 17, and by the time he had been arrested, Yezhov, the major architect of the purge, had been purged, and now Beria was head of the NKVD. With Yezhov gone, the Great Purge, as it was called, had calmed down. But let us look further into Zinoviev's story. At no point did our dissident, Zinoviev, even acquire a weapon to carry out this intended, quote-unquote, assassination. Finnbol presents Zinoviev's so-called plot as an actual attempt with a degree of backing from an underground terrorist organization, and not what it actually was, the dreamy schemes of an angsty teenager discontented with the present Soviet leadership. There was no need to frame Zinoviev because there was nothing to frame him for. He didn't do anything, and he wasn't going to do anything. They released him because he had no weapon. He had no plan. There was no plot. Our other Zinoviev, Grigori Zinoviev, on the other hand, was different. He was a longtime Bolshevik, previously Lenin's prime yes-man, until October showed us cowardice, and he balked on all of his revolutionary principles. Zinoviev, at one point, was the head of the Comintern, co-leader of the party, and had many followers within the USSR. Although politically neutralized at the time, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and all those other old opponents still had the possibility of being threats, much in the same way that a distant relative of a king still has the possibility to usurp the throne, even if he is further down the line of succession. Can Finnbol not tell the difference in prominence between a politically experienced Bolshevik and a teenager who wasn't even alive when October took place? This is the only time in all of his videos that he brings up Zinoviev, who would have been 12 years old when Kirov died. He has nothing to do with the trials, yet Finnbol dedicates a whole section of his video to him. This is 12 minutes into the video, mind you. Isn't it curious that in his video about, the Moscow trials, instead of talking about the majority of the accused, he brings up people not relevant to the trials? I'm not even lying either. In all of his videos, he only names some of the defendants, and they're the names that you're already familiar with, like Radek, Zinoviev, Bukharin. However, he doesn't mention the names of the majority of the defendants whose stories are key to the trials, and there's a major issue with that. Unlike him, I'm actually going to discuss the defendants, and once you get to the second section, you're going to hear the names of the accused, what they were specifically accused of, and the plots which they confessed to have taken part in. The thing is, for every Alexander Zinoviev, you have your Orlovs, your Bezmenovs, your Kravchenkos, and your Solzhenitsyns. And there is one thing that is true about all of them, and that is, to some degree, they are all lying for the spectacle. Even if there is a kernel of truth within what they say, they are still not to be trusted.
Despite their best efforts, Khrushchev, Gorbachev, capitalists, no one has been able to find any evidence that Stalin had Kirov killed.
Well, on this, I would like to use the very elaborate, the quite dialectical schema created by one of the preeminent revolutionaries of our time, the greatest Marxist of the 21st century, Comrade Grover Furr. As we all know, the absence of evidence is the evidence of absence. Thus, since we do not have evidence Trotsky was working with the Japanese, it is surely the case that the evidence was destroyed. Therefore, since we do not have evidence that Stalin killed Kirov, the only possible explanation is that Stalin killed Kirov. Right now, I'm going to use a personal argument that you might not like, and I promise there is more to come, and not just anecdotes, but genuinely appraise the situation as it occurred. When Kirov died, the opposition gained quite literally nothing. Imagine, if you will, that you created an extensive terrorist network over the course of years. You have agents in the army, the police, the government institutions, and factories all over the nation. You've created this massive network, all the while the secret police and the party leadership is entirely unaware. You have thousands of agents, and apparently millions of sympathizers, but also at the same time, no one actually supports you. Still, imagine that during the course of your terroristic plot, during the course of 2 years of planning, that you only kill one guy. According to some of the testimonies of the accused, many of the terrorists who were prepared to kill Stalin, Molotov, etc. were in the same vicinity, in the same room even, as their targets, and the only reason they failed to accomplish their objectives was because of lack of nerve. In this widespread terrorist network, the only one who was really about it was Nikolaev? Okay, you want me to believe that? But again, imagine that not only are you only able to kill this one person, imagine that in the aftermath of killing just one guy, your entire terrorist network gets caught and unraveled in a matter of days. And in the aftermath, all of you are sent to prison and killed. That, my friends, would have to be simultaneously the most successfully hidden, but also the most ridiculously incompetent conspiracy known to man. These are hardened Bolsheviks that we're talking about. And during the course of their terrorist activity, they killed one person? The only person who gained from Kirov's murder was Stalin. And I don't even believe that Stalin killed Kirov, because like Finnbol said, we don't have proof, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. But what's even more ridiculous than thinking that Stalin might have killed his friend is thinking that that coward Zinoviev would have had any hand in the plot.
Jules Humbert-Droz, a Swiss communist and political ally of Bukharin, wrote in his memoirs about their last meeting in 1929. Bukharin had told him that they were planning to assassinate Stalin. He had objected, and they had split over this. His memoirs were published in 1971, well after de-Stalinization had claimed Bukharin was innocent. Quote, "Before leaving, I went to see Bukharin for the last time, not knowing whether I would see him again upon my return. We had a long and frank conversation. He brought me up to date with the contacts made by his group with the Zinoviev-Kamenev fraction in order to coordinate the struggle against the power of Stalin. I did not hide from him that I did not approve of this liaison of the opposition's. The struggle against Stalin is not a political program. This bloc is without principles which will crumble away before achieving any results." Bukharin also told me that they had decided to utilize individual terror in order to rid themselves of Stalin. On this point as well I expressed my reservations. Bukharin doubtlessly had understood that I would not bind myself blindly to his fraction, whose sole program was to make Stalin disappear. This was our last meeting.
When Finnbol brings up Humbert-Droz, he talks about him as if he was a one-time Bukharinist. He literally refers to Droz as just, quote, a Swiss communist and political ally of Bukharin. While this is true, it downplays heavily just how important Droz was in the communist movement, before he was unceremoniously removed from the Swiss Communist Party. As Robert Alexander writes, for several decades, Jules Humbert-Droz was the most outstanding Swiss communist and one of the secretaries of the Communist International, and a figure of prestige throughout the communist movement. It was he who largely inspired the resistance to the Comintern of those who subsequently established the Swiss communist opposition. However, Humbert-Droz remained loyal to the Comintern until after the international communist opposition had ceased to exist. Although the ideas of Jules Humbert-Droz conformed closely to those of the international communist opposition, he never joined it. Instead, he remained a loyal functionary, an official of the Stalin-dominated Comintern and of its Swiss party. Humbert-Droz, just like another massive figure expelled from the Comintern, M.N. Roy, was the Comintern's loyal servant even when they were kicking him around. Humbert-Droz in his memoirs writes that Bukharin told him that he wished to use individual terror against Stalin. Humbert-Droz tells us this 40 years after the fact. Yet, when Humbert-Droz was still in the upper echelons of the Comintern, he was advising Dimitrov on how to propagandize the trials. If Droz was aware of Bukharin's statement, why didn't he say it in 1938 during Bukharin's trial? Better yet, why didn't he mention it 10 years before, as this was an obvious threat on Stalin's life? Is this really the evidence that we're taking? I certainly know that Finnbol would not take seriously anyone who uses Khrushchev's memoirs as evidence, and neither would I. But yet here he is, ready to take a statement made by this Comintern affiliate decades after the supposed event occurred. Droz's statement is an uncorroborated allegation, and to take it as definitive evidence that Bukharin was involved in a plot is beyond silly. Again, you might not like hearing this, but truly ask yourself, if you're preparing or already operating a secret underground conspiracy, would you just casually tell someone, even a close friend, that you're about to commit a crime? If Finnbol uses these allegations by single individuals, then I must therefore also be allowed to use Khrushchev's statements as proof that Stalin was guilty of his alleged crimes. Could I not? I mean, Khrushchev was in Stalin's inner circle. Furthermore, Robert Alexander writes on Cohen's conversation with Humbert-Droz about this allegation. Stephen Cohen, author of the major biography of Bukharin in English, is convinced that there was something peculiar in Humbert-Droz's relationship with Bukharin. When Cohen interviewed Humbert-Droz in 1966, the Swiss told him that, in 1929, Bukharin had suggested to him the need to murder Stalin. However, Humbert-Droz refused to give any details of where such a conversation had taken place. Cohen thinks that perhaps part of the price Humbert-Droz had to pay for not being purged during the 1929 to 1941 period was that he provided the Soviet secret police with something that they could use against Bukharin, ergo, the story about Bukharin's talk about murdering Stalin. However, as Cohen notes, such a charge was not included in the indictment when Bukharin was finally brought to trial and shot in 1938. Finnbol dares to present himself as an investigator, yet he at no point scrutinizes his own sources and cites them uncritically as damning evidence. We are 15 minutes into the video, and we have yet to have any physical evidence presented to us, just comparisons and statements by people not connected to the trials. Still, let us assume that Droz's statement is the undeniable truth, that Bukharin did say he was prepared to turn to terrorist acts. Words and actions are two different things, as Finnbol certainly knows, since Trotsky his whole life, always by word, always by writing, denounced individualist terror. Yet in the case of Soviet Russia, we see that he was apparently prepared to engage with terrorist measures. Thus, people can say things and in the future, or even in the present, betray what they say. Who is to say that Bukharin was actually going to do what he supposedly said? Droz is the only source for this accusation against Bukharin. I won't declare that Droz is lying, but his comments, just like everything Orlov says, is unsubstantiated and unverifiable. What can we do with this statement that is given 4 decades after the fact, when we have no physical evidence of Bukharin's participation in such activities? And the same issue occurs yet again with the next person that Finnbol brings up, Grigory Tokaev. When Finnbol brings up Tokaev, he gives him a whole background. He mentions his defection, his anti-Stalin political associations, and his communications and associations with Bukharin. Finnbol then tragically only selects the portions of Tokaev's statements which look good for his argument. Finnbol mentions Droz's comments on Bukharin's willingness to engage in terror, but then in Tokaev's book, he somehow misses Tokaev's statements that as much as Bukharin spoke about doing things, he was never actually willing to turn his words into action. Bukharin wanted us to act with greater determination. We were to snatch the initiative from the hands of the Stalin-Molotov-Kirov triumvirate. We should stimulate the younger generation of workers and peasants into a movement of opposition. We should make our we, and indeed our every I, ring louder. For were we not both citizens and masters of our own country, and the legitimate heirs of the revolution? Bukharin was working up a spirit of opposition by intensifying ideological work, by agitation and propaganda, by persuasion and theoretical discussion. By these methods, an appeal should be made to the youth among the workers and the peasants. We should pit our individual personalities against Stalin's robot functionaries and bureaucrats. The task, he said again, is to get the masses to realize the dangerous political and economic consequences of Stalin, Molotov, and Kirov's general line. But this can only be done by persuasion. How much time will be needed to awaken the consciousness of the mass of the people? And how many years will the people of the USSR be able to grasp how impossible the present road is? Neither I nor Stalin, neither Molotov nor Kirov. Perhaps 5 years? Perhaps as many as 10. You must never lose sight of the fact that in the history of Russia so far, there has never been a single truly democratic day, and this means that it is no use building on illusions and wishful thinking. No revolution is worth an egg until the millions play their part in it and are aware of its aims. This was all typical of Bukharin, this notion of working up a general spirit of resistance without ever a trace of direct organized struggle against the policy of extreme measures. He was ready to talk about a new revolution, yet refused to admit that it was feasible until the masses had acquired a sense of what it all meant. As for us, the younger generation, he urged us to have confidence in ourselves, but also urged us to have patience. 2 years later, In 1934, we attacked Bukharin and his fellows savagely, accusing them of slithering back into the bogs of Stalinism. But eventually, we were to understand that they knew far better than we did what was possible and what was not. The fact that, at our first meeting, he told us nothing could be done to stop forced collectivization did not mean that he did not condemn it. It merely meant that he was less powerful than we had foolishly thought he was. Now, I must admit, at the very least, Tokaev is a much better example of a dissident than fucking. Now, I must admit that at the very least, Tokaev is a much better example of a dissident when compared to Alexander Zinoviev, because, well, he actually was one, as well as a defector. Unlike Zinoviev, Tokaev would have actually been of age and actually would have had some political connections in order to aid in such dissident activities. However, in Tokaev's books, he writes about Stalin's plans for, quote-unquote, world domination. We must also consider that at the time that he and other dissidents were writing these books, the 40s and the 50s, the West was going through an anti-communist frenzy. Thus, during this time, the market for books like his, Orlov's, Kravchenko's, and later Solzhenitsyn's was perfect. In Comrade X, Tokaev speaks of attempts to assassinate Stalin. But what were there? This is a vague statement with no corroboration. For it to be verified, we must know how are these plots foiled, who were the people caught, what were their names, etc. This is important information and it's not given. These supposed 15 attempts on Stalin could have been 15 attempts by his group or 15 attempts by various groups. How much of Tokaev's work is sincere and how much is sensationalized for the public? In your article analyzing the Moscow trials, you write, quote, at the trial, the Zinovievites were accused of plotting to organize the arrest and killing of the entire Stalinist leadership at the 17th Party Congress. This is also corroborated by Tokaev. In 1934, there's a plot to start a revolution by arresting the whole of the Stalinist-packed 17th Congress of the party. Tokaev, Comrade X, page 37. This one single sentence seems damning, but on further investigation, it is not. The whole paragraph which that sentence comes from is relegated to the very end of the 4th chapter of Comrade X in a notes section. The whole paragraph is as follows. There is no mass movement, but there is a tremendous latent force which the active revolutionaries strive to develop. There have been many and varied oppositionist groupings. The first was that of Yenikudze, Shaboldayev, and Medelyov. The long list of those killed in purges suggests many others. In 1934, there was a plot to start a revolution by arresting the whole of the Stalinist-packed 17th Party Congress. In 1942, there is the armed uprising of the North Caucasian peoples, more especially of the Chechen nation, who tried to establish their independence against both Stalin and Hitler. These are representative instances of opposition. Admittedly, many of the oppositionists are not in sympathy with the West, but must all the fault for this attitude be laid at their door? What interest has the West taken in the subordinated nations? What publicity, for instance, did Stalin's policy of genocide in the North Caucasus ever receive in the West? How easily, by the use of the name Russia, do Western journalists lead their readers to forget the existence of the other members of the USSR and thereby serve the purpose of the Kremlin's state monopolistic imperialism? When Tokaev speaks about his organization of dissidents, he gives names. We know about Klava, Yeryomenko, Demokratov, Riz, and the mysterious Comrade X, but he says very little about the supposed organization that killed Kirov. On this 1934 plot, he doesn't say who was involved, how it was to be carried out, or anything. He just references it at the end of chapter 4 of the book. Finnbol assumes that Tokaev is saying that Zinoviev and the accused were involved in this plot, as well as the plot to kill Kirov, since it lines up with the trials. Yet, in Betrayal of an Ideal, Tokaev writes, Pravda carried a long article of guidance to agitprop personnel regarding the Zinoviev opposition. Thousands of newspapers and magazines, scores of books and pamphlets, countless broadcasts and lectures began to analyze the concept Zinovievist, while Zinoviev himself and his associates, not one of whom had the slightest connection with the assassination, were arrested by the NKVD. The names Leningrad Center and Moscow Center were invented by the Stalinists to conceal the names of other existing organizations. The alleged members of the Leningrad Center were J.J. Kotolinov, V.V. Rumyantsev, S.O. Mendelstam, N.I. Myasnikov, V.S. Levshin, N.N. Shatsky, L.I. Sositsky, and L.V. Nikolaev. All these alleged Zinovievists had in fact detested the very name of Zinoviev ever since his declaration of loyalty to Stalin at the 17th Party Congress. How is it that Tokaev can admit to the existence of the plot that Zinoviev was allegedly a part of, and then, at the same time, say that he was in fact not a part of this plot? If there was a 1934 plot, in Tokaev's mind, Zinoviev and the rest of the accused were not a part of it. On page 43 of Comrade X, Tokaev states also that Bukharin was one of the authors of the new constitution. However, J. Getty proves that this is not true. This is but one of those myths that Tokaev makes use of, and it's a myth that has been repeated for decades. It's a myth that I believed until recently, but it's just not true. And even though it's not true, throughout his book, Tokaev repeats that many times Bukharin was secretly an author of the Constitution. If this claim that Tokaev holds onto so tightly is untrue, just how much of what Tokaev says is untrue? Tokaev, just like Orlov, and just like any other defector, is not a reliable source. He is writing about events after the fact, and what he says can't be verified. But for Finnbol, he is a convenient source because Tokaev says what he wants to hear. Thus, as a result, he quotes him approvingly without considering the source's validity. If Finnbol is willing to accept the claims of this defector, then logic dictates that he must also accept Orlov's and other anti-Soviet defectors' claims, which paint Stalin and the Soviet system in a bad light. Yet we all know he won't ever do such a thing. And he is right not to do so, because they can't be trusted. Now, Tokaev does admit that he belonged to an anti-Stalin group, but does this serve to prove the existence of an overarching conspiracy? It is not undoubtable that internal Soviet opposition groups existed. This is totally believable and verifiable. With Tokaev, we see that a group has existed, but in the subject of whether the group in question, the Zinovievite Trotskyite terrorist center, was real, Tokaev's statements do not work towards proving that. I repeat once more, Tokaev himself states that Kamenev and Zinoviev had no connection to the Kirov murder. In his very book, he believed that the Moscow trials were ridiculous and the charges were fraudulent, and comments on the cowardice of the defendants who gave confessions to crimes that they did not commit. Finnbol ignores all of this because it does not support his argument. Do you know what this is called? Cherry picking. And as Finnbol does this, he compromises his claims and does more damage to himself and his argument. And just to highlight one more thing, as you might have seen, and using Tokaev and Droz as evidence to back up his argument, Finnbol makes use of two sources that contradict themselves in their description of Bukharin's personality. Droz tells us in 1929 that Bukharin personally told him that he was ready to engage in terrorism. Tokaev tells us that Bukharin encouraged him to engage in debate and argumentation, and that Bukharin was too scared to ever do anything. And you might say, well, perhaps Bukharin was keeping the finer details of his plot hidden from Tokaev. But Tokaev is the exact person that Bukharin was looking to recruit for supposed terrorist actions, yet he doesn't? Bukharin is going to tell a loyal Comintern agent that he wants to kill Stalin, but not an active dissident? Finnbol's usage of his sources is horrendous, and it would not hold well in a serious academic environment. Truly, he's a disciple of Comrade Fur in this regard, as his master is willing to cite anti-Semites. Now we get to the fun part. Tukhachevsky. I'ma be real with you, like not gonna lie, that nigga probably did it. If I was in the jury on some Uncle Ruckus type shit, I'd be in the stands shouting, guilty! That nigga is guilty! Ow, I got the rope right here! But on Tukhachevsky, I have no need, desire, or even ability to defend him. Especially since out of everyone here, he was the only one who realistically could have actually been guilty. And honestly, I wouldn't doubt if he was. Good job, Stalin. You stopped yourself from getting 18th Brumared by 20th century Napoleon. The case with Tukhachevsky is much different, however. While the other three Moscow trials were widely publicized and observers were allowed to watch, this trial took place in secret, and the transcript wasn't available to the public. Tukhachevsky also was not a communist and had very weird pagan religious views before he joined the Bolsheviks. The case with Tukhachevsky is subject to many varying claims and interpretations, and all of it is caught up with the myth of the so-called Red Napoleon. It is hard to talk about Tukhachevsky because there is this aura of mystification that surrounds his name. We are constantly told this unverifiable idea that Stalin had him killed for some vendetta he had over him from 20 years ago during the Polish-Soviet War. With such a mythic figure, whose demise seemingly damaged the Red Army as seen by his tragically poor performance during the Winter War, it is hard to talk about him. I mean, this is the Red Napoleon. He was gonna save the USSR during the Nazi invasion. If only that big dumb Stalin didn't kill him. So I don't particularly care about these legends, which often have zero connection to actual history. I have read many things. For one, I've read somewhere that Tukhachevsky was framed, that the Nazi SS official Reinhard Heydrich, through the Soviet triple agent Skoblin, was able to initiate a complex conspiracy implicating Tukhachevsky in a fake anti-Soviet plot. I have also read that Tukhachevsky was in contact with anti-Hitler German military officers and was in fact preparing a plot and indeed prepared to enact this plot on May 1st, 1937, before he postponed it and was eventually caught. The source for this claim is a Maoist website called Revolutionary Democracy. On their website, they write, Despite the pro-German statements of Tukhachevsky, Hitler and others in the Nazi leadership were not happy over clandestine contacts between the military leaders of Germany and the USSR. The Nazi leaders considered that the establishment of the military dictatorship in Russia might stimulate similar developments in Germany, and the military dictator of Russia, Tukhachevsky, might help his German colleagues during the future coup. Hitler decided to thwart the joint conspiracy of the military leaders of the two countries. He ordered the sending of the stolen documents to Moscow, by adding to them fabrications to make the materials even more shocking. German intelligence chief Walter Schellenberg later wrote that the false editions constituted but a minor part of the whole collection, which was secretly sold to the Soviet Union. According to Anna Strong, who Finnbol quotes, the Moscow press announced that the accused generals had been in the pay of Hitler and agreed to help him get the Ukraine. But according to Revolutionary Democracy, Tukhachevsky was not working with Hitler, but with German army officials in the Wehrmacht who were opposed to Hitler, the Septemberverschwörung to be exact. Trotsky, we are told, was also working with Hitler, and according to Molotov, he was working with Tukhachevsky. But now we have two stories. Hitler was apparently paying Tukhachevsky so that Tukhachevsky could hand Ukraine over to him, but Hitler also intervenes in the Tukhachevsky conspiracy and contributes to Tukhachevsky's downfall? You see the contradiction here, I hope. In this scenario presented by Revolutionary Democracy, if Trotsky is to be implicated within the Tukhachevsky affair, then he can't be said to be working also with Hitler, because then his partner, Tukhachevsky, is working against Hitler. Either Trotsky is in bed with Hitler, or he is in bed with Tukhachevsky. It can't be both. And in that absurd scenario where it is, I must wonder how Trotsky might have imagined his role in this scenario, where both his partners are attempting to destroy the other. And even in that scenario where he was working with just one person, I must wonder how Trotsky imagined Hitler or Tukhachevsky would just allow him to waltz back into power, when he had no leverage over either of them while in exile in Norway. Is Trotsky really that naive? Regardless, out of all the supposed plots that may have occurred in the USSR, this is the one that could be true, and the only one that even had the potential to be successful in any capacity. If Tukhachevsky was involved in a plot, I am certain that his affair would have been independent of Zinoviev and Bukharin's supposed plots. It is genuinely hard for me to believe that these people would have had such a hatred for Stalin that they would have been willing to destroy the very thing which they had been spending their whole lives trying to achieve. Tukhachevsky is a different story, however, and it's a story that doesn't interest me. I want to talk about the publicly displayed trials, so that's what I will focus on.
Trotsky and the secession of Ukraine. Immediately prior to the Nazi invasion of Poland, Trotsky began arguing in favor of Ukrainian secession from the USSR and rebellion against the Soviet Union. Quote, "To the totalitarian bureaucracy, Soviet Ukraine became an administrative division of an economic unit and a military base of the USSR. Kremlin's attitude today is the same as it is towards all oppressed nationalities, all colonies and semi-colonies. Not a trace remains of the former confidence and sympathy of the Western Ukrainian masses for the Kremlin. Only hopeless pacifist blockheads are capable of thinking that the emancipation and unification of the Ukraine can be achieved by peaceful diplomatic means. Since the latest murderous purge in the Ukraine, in my opinion, there can be at this present time only one slogan: a united, free, independent, workers' and peasants' Soviet Ukraine." Trotsky, Problem of Ukraine. Trotsky called for a united Soviet Ukraine, but realistically, all the communist forces in Ukraine supported Stalin, while the opponents of Stalin were bourgeois nationalists and fascists. What kind of sense does it make to call for Ukraine to leave the USSR, as Hitler was approaching its western border? It would weaken the Soviet Union and hand Ukraine over to Hitler. In his confession in 1936, Tukhachevsky testified, "During the winter of 1935-1936, Pyatakov told me that Trotsky had now asked us to ensure the defeat of the USSR in a war, even if this meant giving Ukraine to the Germans and the Primorye to the Japanese. In order to prepare USSR's defeat, all forces, both within the USSR and outside the USSR, would have to be made ready." End of quote. Bukharin confirmed this. Quote, "In the summer of 1934, Radek told me that directions had been received from Trotsky, that Trotsky had already promised the Germans a number of territorial concessions, including the Ukraine. I objected to this. I considered essential that he, Radek, should write and tell Trotsky that he was going too far. This point of view of Trotsky's was politically and tactically inexpedient." Bukharin, report of the court proceedings in the case of the anti-Soviet bloc of rights and Trotskyites. In his testimony, Pyatakov, another member of the right opposition, said, quote, "First, the German fascists promised to adopt a favorable attitude towards the Trotskyite Zinovievite bloc, and to support it if it comes to power, either in the time of war or before war, should it succeed in doing so. But in return the fascists are to receive the following compensation: a general favorable attitude towards German interests and towards German government on all questions of international policy. Certain territorial concessions would have to be made, and these territorial concessions have been defined. In particular, mention was made of territorial concessions in a veiled form, which were called, quote, not resisting Ukrainian national bourgeois forces in the events of their self-determination, unquote." Vyshinsky. What does that mean? Pyatakov. It means in a veiled form what Radek spoke about here. Should the Germans set up their own Ukrainian government, ruling the Ukraine not through their German governor-general, but perhaps through a hetman, at any rate, should the Germans quote-unquote self-determine the Ukraine, the Trotskyist Zinovievite bloc will not oppose it. End of quote. This truly is what would most likely have happened. If Ukraine's nationalist forces had seceded, Ukraine of the specters of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism and Nazi collaborators. Sadly, such prejudices run deep, and have a tradition within Marxism as far back as Engels and Luxemburg. With the rise of Stalinism, things have worsened to such a scale that it is at times difficult to get a rational and thoughtful discussion on the subject. The Ukrainian question, to quote Trotsky, is being placed on the order of the day, and this time with redoubled force. End of quote. In the split that occurred between the left and right of the OUN in 1940, the left moved steadily to take on socialist politics injected into it by the working class. End of quote. They even go so far as to defend the UPA, the military wing of the Nazi collaborating Melnik faction of the OUN, which carried out a policy of ethnic cleansing against Poles, Jews, and other minorities. Quote, "The UPA is accused of being fascistic for the reason that during the war it waged an armed struggle against Russian Stalinism. The UPA remains one of the most unknown revolutionary movements in Soviet history, deliberately portrayed by the Stalinists as collaborators." End of quote. To these Trotskyists, the UPA is a legitimate revolutionary movement who are apparently only seen as fascistic because of alleged Stalinist propaganda. This is truly cringeworthy reading in the context of the recent Ukrainian fascist coup. These are the UPA supporters. They are Nazis. The Ukrainian militant neo-Nazi group, Pravi Sector, Right Sector, has even adopted the UPA flag as their official flag. This is the result of Trotsky's writings, which state that anyone who opposes the Soviet Union with even the slightest quasi-leftist or quasi-revolutionary rhetoric is legitimate and worthy of support from the Trotskyists. Trotsky consistently used propaganda which equated Stalin with Hitler, or saying that Stalin was worse than Hitler, blaming Soviet communism for Hitler, and legitimizing opponents of the Soviet Union, who in the case of Ukraine would be OUN fascists. In his article on Ukraine, he employed an interesting propaganda tactic. At first, Trotsky seems to be criticizing Hitler, but in fact he's only criticizing Stalin, putting all the blame on Stalin, and saying that Hitler is only an outcome of Soviet crimes. Quote, "But for the rape of Soviet Ukraine by the Stalinist bureaucracy, there would be no Hitlerite Ukrainian policy." Trotsky, Problem of the Ukraine. It is not at all surprising that Trotsky would make criticisms of Nazism even as he was helping Hitler. He was entirely willing to lie and do whatever it took to achieve his aims. Moreover, in their substance, his policies were not anti-Hitler but anti-Soviet and pro-Hitler. Of course, Trotsky had no personal love for Hitler, nor did Hitler like the Jew Trotsky, but they were useful for each other as they shared a common enemy. Analysis of Trotsky's political propaganda. Quote, Adolf Hitler read Trotsky's autobiography as soon as it was published. Hitler's biographer, Konrad Hayden, tells in Der Führer how the Nazi leader surprised the circle of his friends in 1930 by bursting into rapturous praise of Trotsky's book. "Brilliant," cried Hitler, waving Trotsky's My Life at his followers. I have learned a great deal, and so can you. Kahn and Sayers, The Great Conspiracy Against Russia.
What? Oh my gosh. Hitler read Trotsky's biography? Why, this is an outrage. Sometimes I truly wonder how some of you people became communists in the first place, because it certainly wasn't through critical thinking. And now you might take offense to this, and I think you should, because some of you guys are just so stupid. Why does it matter that Hitler read Trotsky's autobiography? Genuinely, I don't understand why you treat this as though it's something so fantastical and amazing. I should not have to explain to my studious dialectical materialist why it is irrelevant that Hitler at any point in his life read anything written by Trotsky, but I guess I have to. Would it not be prudent to read the biography of your prime enemy? I am certain that at some point in his life, Stalin read Mein Kampf, and obviously, that does not make Stalin a devotee or friend of Hitler. The whole world were enemies of Bolshevism in 1930, and at that moment, they were witnessing the internal strife that the Bolsheviks were going through. Wouldn't it please them to learn more about their enemy, and learn more about these divisions as they were ongoing, as Hitler most likely did? Furthermore, this is a small sentence that's been quoted in a book from another book. Let's read the whole paragraph which the quote comes from. In 1930, Hitler surprised a circle of his friends by asking them if they had read the just published autobiography of Leon Trotsky, the great Jewish leader of the Russian Revolution, and what they thought of it. As might have been expected, the answer was, yes, loathsome book, Memoirs of Satan, to which Hitler replied, loathsome? Brilliant! I have learned a great deal from it, and so can you. Himmler, however, remarked that he had not only read Trotsky, but studied all available literature about the political police in Russia, the Tsarist Okhrana, the Bolshevist Cheka, and GPU, and he believed that if such a task should ever fall to his lot, he could perform it better than the Russians. With this in his mind, he drilled his troop, imbued it with his furious arrogance and contempt of humanity, thus arming its men with the moral force to massacre their own people as well as foreigners, and to regard this as absolutely necessary. Interesting. It seems that Der Führer was interested in more than just Trotsky. It's quite curious that the authors of The Great Conspiracy omit that Hitler was studying not just Trotsky, but the Cheka and the GPU, as well as the whole history of the Russian secret police. Why might the authors omit this, if only to make it seem like Hitler was purely interested in Trotsky? Perhaps because Robert Kahn was a CPUSA member. In the book that he cites, it is never stated what Hitler learned from the book, but just that he learned a great deal from it. But that can mean literally anything. Like I said, I'm not going to respond to everything he says, and initially I had a whole section on his piece on Ukraine, but I decided to cut it out. Defending Trotsky's theory is something I do not care to do. All I will say is that when Trotsky wrote this article in 1939, his apparent plot to hand over Ukraine to the Nazis was already publicly revealed during the trials. I can't imagine Trotsky would be so stupid to write an article about the secession of Ukraine when people might be scrutinizing his work for any pro-German sentiment in them. But at the same time when Trotsky wrote and had this article published, the negotiations for the signing for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty were already ongoing. I don't see why Hitler would be using Trotsky as his mouthpiece for agitating for Ukrainian independence at a time where he needs food as well as fuel from the Soviets for his plan to evade starvation from a British blockade. One reason Finnbol brings this article up is so that he can connect it to the lie that Trotskyists were supporting the UPA and the OUN during World War II. But I've already demonstrated that this is a distortion on his end, so I'm not even going to entertain this portion of the video. And like I said in the beginning, the final section of Finnbol's video is just a repeat of the standard allegations of Trotsky and Trotskyists supporting fascism. Allegations I'm not going to entertain. Finnbol uses a selection of Trotsky's quotes where he advocates the overthrow of Stalin among other things, and uses them to demonstrate that Trotsky was trying to secretly engineer support for fascism, or that he was saying Stalin was worse than Hitler. He uses quotes from Ho Chi Minh and Mao that state Chinese and Vietnamese Trotskyists were agents of Japanese fascism, which I don't believe. Lastly, he uses that oft-repeated, but again completely unverifiable quote attributed to Gramsci by the Euro anti-communist Tokaty that Trotsky was the whore of fascism. The last 20 minutes of the video is not worth my time. Some of the stuff he talks about is not relevant or just drivel. For example, he talks about the Barcelona May Days for not even 30 seconds, yet somehow within that short time frame, he earnestly describes the POUM as Trotskyist and seriously treats the event as if it was some planned uprising in favor of Franco. This last segment of the video has even less to do with the trials than most of the video, and it adds very little to the video itself. The purpose of this first video, I believe, is to push further the narrative that Trotsky supported fascism, and thus make it more believable for viewers that Trotsky could be involved in a terrorist conspiracy. I'm not interested in talking about it. I don't care to defend Trotsky's character or to give a correct demonstration of his political views and agenda. I am not a Trotskyist. His ideas mean nothing to me, so someone else can do that. I want to focus specifically on the trial itself. My main interest is the validity of the trials and the claims made in them. Is that not the subject of this video? That the trials were hoaxes? You would think in a video about the trials themselves, that would be your main focus. But so far, it seems more than anything that you're trying to convince people that Trotsky is part and parcel to the rise of fascism. You can claim Trotsky is a supporter of fascism all you want, but throughout this hour-long video, you have not definitively proven that Trotsky was working with Hitler or that he had terrorist cells in the Soviet Union. Most of your evidence revolves around the confessions of the accused, but we need physical evidence. And in this whole hour-long video, Finnbol never actually states why people thought the trials were hoaxes. Granted, he does talk about it in his second video, but he does not. That video is 20 minutes long, and there are many holes that Finnbol doesn't talk about. He only talks about one, and we're going to get into that later. In his article/video titled Analyzing the Moscow Trials, he writes, "Why would someone believe the trials were a fraud? The most common reason is simply that anti-communist historians claim the trials were a fraud. For most anti-communists, this is the only reason. Finnbol must believe that no one has ever in the 90 years since these trials occurred demonstrated proof that they could be hoaxes. In his mind, they just don't look at the material. They just say it's propaganda. Well, Finnbol, I shall demonstrate why the trials appear to be fraudulent in the eyes of many." In Finnbol's quest to defend the Moscow trials, he relies almost solely on the testimonies of the accused, as well as the opinions of some bourgeois media outlets when the trial first came around in 1936. He takes to heart the testimonies of some so-called observers. Finnbol argues that the trials also couldn't have been rehearsed because Stalin believed in them, that Dmitrov wrote in his diary about them, that Stalin was genuinely curious about how the interrogations went, and because of that, they couldn't have been staged in any manner. Finnbol talks about the allegations of incredibleness of the charges, but his only method of disproving that they were incredible is using the opinions of observers. On these observers, we will talk more, but first I will demonstrate the holes that Finnbol fails to discuss and show why people don't take the trials seriously. You would think in a video like this, we'll be given the names of the wider network of conspirators by Finnbol. They're discussed in the transcripts. Why is it that we only mostly hear about the high-ranking members of the Bolshevik Party who are involved in the organization, but not the agents who actually carry out the supposed plots? The only one that he speaks of is Nikolaev, the only one who actually ever managed to kill anybody. We must know who is involved with what. How did they get the weapons? What were the weapons? How did they communicate amongst one another without the secret police noticing? How is it, despite being spied on, that they managed to effectively plan and coordinate this terrorist opposition for 2 years? Finnbol, it is on you to demonstrate when, why, how, and yet you don't. And trust that when I begin to quote from Heisler's book, you will see for yourself the rampant contradictions. And before I get into that, I must also say that confessions given under duress or extracted via coercion cannot be used as evidence in a court of law. Coercion also does not mean torture. They do not need to be physically abused for confessions to be acquired. And I won't even waste my time in trying to prove that torturous methods or threats were in fact used to extract confessions, because, despite Finnbol's statements to the contrary, much in the manner that Trotsky is a liar, as he says one thing and believes another, I would say Finnbol obviously believes that the Soviet secret police made use of such methods, as he himself enjoys doing roleplay of NKVD agents committing sexual assaults on minors on his Discord. And this is no baseless accusation. Finnbol has admitted to himself and apologized, unless the confession of the accused is not enough to administer guilt. Moving on, I will demonstrate with Heisler's book that the evidence that we are given is not just flimsy, but at times contradictory or just blatantly false. In any proper court of law, those contradictions we need to be sorted out. But we aren't dealing with a proper trial, but a frame-up trial. But before then, let's make a comparison. Let us compare the cases of these accused terrorists, these so-called terrorists, to the case of an actual terrorist. Bukharin and Rykov at no point were proven to have possessed weapons, nor did either of them with their own hands take anyone's life. Our character, the social democrat Friedrich Adler, straight up murdered the Austrian president Karl von Stuck while the country was in the middle of a war. I say again that in broad daylight, Adler blicked this nigga. He walked that nigga down like he was King Von. He put his ass on a shirt. He was on a mission and he did what he wanted to do without hesitation. He dropped him. He Swiss cheesed him. He blew his wig back. He shot him in public in broad daylight in front of so many people. He shot Bourgeois Pig 3 times in a dining room. There were dozens of witnesses. He said loud and proud, down with absolutism, we want peace. then just waited for the cops to come pick him up. He was apprehended at that moment with the murder weapon. Adler was then taken to trial in May 1917, a few months after the act. Adler was allowed to speak freely at his trial, where he openly stated he took this action in violation of his own principles as a Marxist and revolutionary protest of the war. Adler was initially sentenced to death, but obviously not put to death immediately, despite committing one of the highest acts of treason possible in the middle of a war. Later, his sentence was commuted to just 18 years, and then they just let him go! This guy, who was objectively always an opponent of the regime, literally murdered, without a shadow of a doubt, one of its top members in government in broad daylight, and he just got away with it. The most Bukharin or Ryutin could have been charged with, if they were guilty, is conspiracy or being accessories, but not the charge of terrorism itself. Adler, again, as I have stated, was a social democrat, and thus was no friend of Zinoviev or any of the accused. But before you say, why are you citing this bourgeois social democrat scum? Adler's revolutionary credentials are undeniable. Unlike so many social democrats who capitulated to national defensism during the war, he protested and he took up action while the rest of his party remained passive. After the war, the new Austrian Communist Party even tried to recruit him. And even within his article denouncing the Moscow trials as a witchcraft trial, Adler still writes minor praises of Soviet economic and social policy. And despite being critical of the regime, he supported its existence. When the trials were announced, Adler and other socialists sent a telegram to Dimitrov in the Comintern. They requested two very simple things. Firstly, that the accused be allowed to have a defending counsel that was independent of the Soviet government. And secondly, that no death sentence be applied for their supposed crimes, even if they are found guilty. In response to these basic requests, Adler and the other signers of the telegram were labeled as reactionaries, and Dimitrov attacked them. Is this not silly and childish? We must also consider that precedent for this sort of thing had already been established. When the trial of the left SRs who tried to overthrow the Soviet regime in 1918 occurred, they were allowed to receive foreign socialist counsel. Now, to ask for the same thing once more 10 years later is to join in bed with reactionaries? Once more, some of the socialists at this time who were recently invited to join into a united front with the Soviets simply wished for the Soviets to enact a fair trial so that it did not damage their prestige. Norman Thomas wrote quite explicitly, "Everything we know of the character and beliefs of these men makes the story highly improbable. The Stalin government must be made to understand that intelligent public opinion will not accept its charges as proof. Neither will it accept the results of the ordinary political trial as conducted in Russia. A government which, following the assassination of Kirov, summarily put to death more than 100 persons without trial, has to win its way back to the confidence of men who believe that civil liberty is more than a plaything of one group or faction in a grim struggle. Those of us who rejoice at Russia's apparent progress towards civil liberty in her new constitution will be exceedingly anxious that the whole cause of liberty and humanity, the whole hope of a working-class solidarity, shall not be set back by fanatical persecution of the Trotskyites. Trotsky is right in asking a special commission to take his own testimony." The response of the Soviets to this simple request is highly suspicious. They claim that every single one of the accused chose to renounce foreign counsel. I don't believe this, and neither should you. Adler puts it very bluntly that he does not like Trotsky, that he has no association with him or the accused, and that all he wished for was a fair trial. He writes, "The defendants in the Moscow trial and their alleged spiritist rector, Trotsky, were not our friends when they were great rulers in the Soviet Union, nor were they when they went into opposition in order to replace the dictatorship of Stalin by their own. We had no reason whatever to expect from Trotsky or Zinoviev that the development of the Soviet Union towards the socialist democracy for which we are hoping would be accelerated if they returned to power. Any attempt to explain our telegram by any solidarity or sympathy, whatever, with the defendants or by any relation to them is pure nonsense, which could only deceive the most abysmally ignorant. The problem is not with the accused, but the accusers, with the methods of political justice in the Soviet Union." Adler himself had reason to be suspicious of Soviet trials, as he already disproved the allegations against one of his comrades who was implicated 5 years prior during the Menshevik show trial. How did he do this? With the very physical evidence that the Soviets and Finnbol are never able to produce. Friedrich Adler had a photograph of one of his comrades very clearly present at the International Socialist Congress in Brussels at the very time when he was stated to have been in the USSR and engaged with a plot with an underground Menshevik organization. Holes and contradictions like this are littered throughout all of the Moscow trials, which we will now finally get into. Firstly, in the original transcripts of the trials, which were made public, there are errors even with the dates and the numbering of the first trial. Heisler writes, Beginning on page 12, the indictment presents what appears to be excerpts from the record of the hearing preceding the drawing up of the indictment. There must have been a slip-up in the numbering of the books of the transcript, since confessions made at an early date appear in transcripts carrying high numbers, and vice versa, while the accused Bakayev's confession in Volume 1 on page 89 is undated, because Volume 3 is dated as of July 5, 1936, and 33 as of July 21st, it would appear that the whole transcript, extending from Volume 1 to 34, must have begun not earlier than July 5, 1936, or thereabouts. Because some of the volume pages are as high as 244, one may assume that approximately 70,000 pages of confession were taken in these proceedings. The contradictions only increase further, as Heisler writes. Criminals, more often than not, have a motive for committing an attack. So confessed Kamenev, who was determined to come to power by any means and who banked on the economic crisis and banked on the collapse of the economic policy of the party leadership. But he was fooled by banking on such contingencies because they obviously failed by the second half of 1932, at which time the country was overcoming the difficulties under the leadership of Stalin, and Kamenev, as he stated, could not help seeing this. The state's attorney informed us that the accused confessed, knowing that they had lost any and all support of the masses, and they realized that the only means by which they could hope to come to power was to organize terroristic acts against the leaders of the USSR and primarily against Stalin. Now, it requires more than the understanding of a prosecuting attorney to follow the logic of conspirators who lost their popular support because of the recognized excellence of the present leadership, and who then expected that they could be restored to leadership as soon as they conspired to and successfully assassinated the successful and beloved leader. Of course, one might expect that these conspirators, after they arrived at their conclusion, that is, that the leadership of Stalin was overcoming all difficulties, would simultaneously arrive at the conclusion that they themselves were political bankrupts and they should have abandoned their fight against Stalin. They did not do so because, as Kamenev said, as a matter of fact, the Bloc was a counter-revolutionary terrorist gang of assassins who strove to seize power in the country by any means whatever. There is no doubt, after reading the remainder of the indictment, that the conspirators recognized the fact that the emergence from the difficulties, the victory of the policy of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union caused, in them, a new wave of animosity and hatred towards the leadership of the party and primarily towards Stalin. Kamenev was very emphatic because he repeated the exact words again 15 pages later on page 27 of the same volume of the transcript. Though testimony covering 15 pages intervened, Kamenev did not fail to repeat everything word by word and comma by comma. Kamenev may be a member of a counter-revolutionary gang of assassins, but possibly, because of his Marxist-Bolshevik past, he does not fail to give credit for the victory of the policy of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union under the leadership of Stalin. This acknowledgement is made in spite of the fact that the indictment states that the accused sank definitively into the swamp of white guardism, joined forces with and merged with the most inveterate enemies of the Soviet power, and became the organizing force of the last remnant of the exploiting classes. In the trial, we are told that Trotsky first gave terrorist instructions either in 1931 or 1932 to Ivan Smirnov. The instructions were orders for the assassination of Stalin. Then 2 years later in 1934, Trotsky is said to have given more terrorist instructions, yet again to someone named Dreitzer. The same instructions apparently, and although the evidence was allegedly destroyed by Dreitzer, he remembered perfectly what Trotsky wrote. And in court, he says the comments of the letter were, quote, "Dear friend, convey that today we have the following main tasks before us. 1. To remove Stalin Voroshilov. 2. To unfold work for organizing nuclei in the army. 3. In the event of war, to take advantage of every setback and confusion to capture leadership." It's already odd that Dreitzer perfectly remembers this letter, which was destroyed 2 years ago, but within the transcript of the trial, a consistent timeline is not given by the attorney. Statements being made will at various times contradict themselves, as Heisler writes. The state's attorney further claims the investigation has established that after the smash-up of the Trotskyite Zinoviev Center in connection with the murder of Comrade Kirov, L. Trotsky himself assumed the leadership of terroristic activities in the USSR. If we recall that Kirov was assassinated on December 1st, 1934, the smash-up of the center and the subsequent assumption of the leadership by Trotsky could not have occurred before December 1934. But Murat Trotsky already testified that, quote, in the middle of 1932, it was then decided to consult L. Trotsky on this question and to obtain his directions. And further, quote, in 1931, contact was established with L. Trotsky. Instructions were received from the latter. The foregoing quotation is from the Confession of Trotsky, which is prefaced by the state's attorney that, quote, the United Trotskyite Zinovievite Center took the path of terrorism under the direction of L.D. Trotsky, who personally gave the members of the United Center a number of verbal and written instructions to this effect. Mr. State's Attorney, is the question unjustified as to whether the first of your statements is true, i.e., that Trotsky assumed leadership of the United Center and of its terrorist activities in late 1934? Or is the correct statement that which claims that assumption had already taken place, quote, in the middle of 1932? Or is it true that Trotsky took over the direction in 1931? Is it not a physical impossibility that more than one of the statements can be correct? And is it not a physical, legal, and political possibility that you are mistaken not only in the dates but also as to your facts? And the facts, as we have seen, will continue to not align with reality. One of the defendants, V.P. Olberg, is stated to have joined a German Trotskyist organization in 1928. He is said to have been active in Trotskyist work since 1930. Olberg is then alleged to have received terrorist instructions from Trotsky and money from Sedov to use as a bribe to acquire a passport. From here, Olberg is said to have entered the USSR with a Honduran passport with a group of unnamed German Trotskyists with the objective of assassinating Stalin. Furthermore, it is stated that Olberg gained his passport with the help of the Gestapo, and that he needed this passport so that he could return to Russia. Dear viewer, Gestapo is an acronym for Geheimstaatspolizei, which literally translates to Secret State Police. This was an organization established in April 1933 by Hermann Goering. In 1930, there was no Gestapo. You might say that the Soviets are using the term Gestapo to simply refer to German secret police in general. But Gestapo is not a catch-all term for any and all secret police. It is a specific agency, a Nazi agency. If the Soviets meant to say that Trotsky was working with the Prussian secret police or some other German police agency, they would have said that. But then such a state of affairs would not make any sense, as it would mean that Trotsky was originally working with either the conservatives or the Social Democrats before he joined Hitler's camp. The Soviets specifically said that Trotsky was working with the Gestapo, despite its anachronistic nature, because they have to maintain the overarching narrative that Trotsky was an agent of the Nazis. Olberg says that he met with a high-ranking Gestapo official. But of course the official is unnamed. As Olberg says, the official did not mention who he was. Olberg further states that the Gestapo agent that he received his passport from was one Vladimir Tukhachevsky in Czechoslovakia. This is Tukhachevsky's statement on the matter. One of the accused in the Moscow trial, Olberg, declared that I, as a Gestapo agent, had procured him a passport of the Honduran Republic so as to make it possible for him to travel in the USSR. V. Olberg appeared in the Slavic Library for the first time in 1933 and presented himself as being an instructor at the Pedagogical Institute of Stalinabad in Tajikistan, signed himself as a German citizen on a questionnaire put to him in order to procure his library identification card, and declared his desire to acquaint himself with the latest publications in the field of history. On the 29th of September, 1933, his library identification card was handed to him. For some time, he visited the reading room. Later, according to his statement, he traveled in the USSR. In the spring of 1934, he reappeared at the library, and on the 4th of May, 1934, his library card was renewed. He frequented the reading room of the library over a longer period of time, declared that he was going to stay here for a considerable time. Yet, since the German embassy refused to prolong his passport for foreign countries, for the same reason, he tried to obtain with the aid of the Pedagogical Institute of Stalinabad a visa for the USSR to continue his pedagogic activities in Stalinabad. On the 21st of January 1935, his library card was extended. He frequented the reading room at intervals. Then, in the spring of 1935, he came to the library and declared he was departing for Stalinabad. I have never heard from him since. Now that I read of his participation in the plot and his calumny directed against my person, I immediately presented a protest to the Soviet legation in Prague, with the request to forward this protest to the High Tribunal at Moscow. It was clear that Olberg, driven by a desire to hide his real accomplices, abusively used my name to complicate matters. In fact, I sent a telegram to the High Court of Moscow, in which I demanded that in the interest of the truth, they should carefully check Olberg's statement, made part of the indictment, which statement I indignantly refuted as calumny. I demanded such checking of Olberg's statement as satisfaction to me. When I was informed of Olberg's deposition made before the court, I found it in the names of other persons unknown to me. The only other person I heard of is V. Olberg's brother, P. Olberg, who visited the reading room of the library as a student. Since I did not find my name mentioned in the verdict, I hope that the court accepted my demand. The connection between Trotsky and Olberg is dubious. For one, who even is V. Olberg? Furthermore, how and why is it that Trotsky was organizing so many assassination plans instead of sticking to the ones he initiated years ago? Trotsky is said to have given Smirnov instructions. Next, he gives them to Dreitzer. But even before he gave either of them instructions, he already gave Olberg instructions as early as 1930. And along with these three, we now learn that he has also given more instructions to KB, Baron Urin, and Prince David to kill Stalin. Heisler describes the course of the so-called plot as follows. Now this Fritz David met L. Trotsky in the autumn of 1932, and L. Trotsky proposed to him that he undertake the historic mission of killing Stalin. Fritz David's conversation with Trotsky took place in November 1932, and I accepted his proposal to kill Stalin. The date of November 1932 may be unimportant to the state's attorney, but it is of colossal importance to those who want to unravel the truth on the basis of the official Russian publications. The official report of court proceedings states, on arriving in the USSR, Baron Urin, who was sent by L. Trotsky simultaneously with Fritz David to the USSR, that is, sometime after November 1932, found Fritz David at an address given to him by Sedov. Fritz David and Baron Urin decided to carry out the assassination of Comrade Stalin at the 7th Congress of the Comintern. The state's attorney may not know the historical fact, but it is a fact, nevertheless, that the 7th Congress of the Comintern was not called before the late spring of 1935, and no living person had any information in November 1932 or 1933, or in the whole year of 1934, whether and when the 7th Congress would convene. How in the name of common sense shall one believe that these confessed terrorists, Baron Urin and Fritz David, that they were able, in 1932 or even 1933, or giving them plenty of time in 1934, to plan to kill Stalin at the 7th Congress of the Communist International, if the 7th Congress was still off in the far future? As a matter of fact, not yet even announced, but planned they did. Baron Urin and Fritz David decided sometime shortly after November 1932 to kill Stalin at the 7th Congress, actually convoked in the summer of 1935. What these determined terrorists did in the USSR for almost 3 years, that is, between the order given to them by Trotsky in 1932 and the 7th Congress of 1935, again, nobody knows, and the prosecutor does not care to know. The Congress was at last convened, and the plan as to the assassination of Stalin was ready for 3 years, but the terrorists failed to do what they confessed they had prepared for years, owing to the fact that Baron Urin was unable to get into the Congress, while Fritz David, although he got into the Congress, could not carry out his criminal intention because he sat far away from the Presidium and had no opportunity of getting near Comrade Stalin. Trotsky failed miserably in selecting his emissaries. He allegedly selected 2 men previously unknown to him who, in November 1932, accepted his proposal to kill Stalin. They go to the USSR and sit around until the summer of 1935, and then, even though one of them is present at the Congress where Stalin is sitting at the Presidium, the terrorists are unable to find an opportunity of getting near Comrade Stalin. The story is presented as evidence of a plot, in spite of the fact that the Congress lasted for several days, and in spite of the fact that the beloved leader Stalin freely mingled with the thousands of delegates. We are now taken over to one Moisey Luria. The court declares that Luria was a member of a Trotskyist terrorist organization. He also states that this organization was created at the behest of a member of the NSDAP and a trusted associate of Heinrich Himmler, Franz Weitz, that his group was made to carry out attacks against Stalin and Voroshilov. On this matter, Heisler writes, "It is interesting to observe the subtle insinuation which permitted the bourgeois reporters present at the trial to arrive at a conclusion which was then headlined by the Stalinite press concerning the connection between Trotsky, the Trotskyites, and Hitler agent Weitz. There is not a word of testimony that Franz Weitz had any connection with the Trotskyites. There is no proof that Franz Weitz existed. While on the one hand, David confessed that it was in November 1932 when Trotsky proposed to him the terroristic act. According to Luria, Weitz, leaving for Germany in August 1932, had already put Luria in charge of the existing terrorist group. Weitz must have been many steps ahead of Trotsky. If this sort of contradictory jumble of dates and evidence is not enough for you, let us provide a further example with the alleged events behind Dreitzer's plan to kill Voroshilov, as Heisler writes. About Dreitzer's work, we get details because, as was further testified to by the state's attorney, quote, in regard to the preparations for the assassination of Comrade Voroshilov, the accused, Trotsky, testified, in the middle of 1934, E. Dreitzer reported to me that simultaneously he was organizing the assassination of Voroshilov, for which purpose Dmitry Schmidt, who was a commander in the army and under no suspicion in the party, was to be prepared. The accused Dreitzer, on July 31, 1936, testified, for the purpose of committing the terrorist act, I recruited Esterman and Gaevsky, and in 1935, Schmidt and Kuzmichev, the latter two, undertook to kill Voroshilov. So one sees that Dreitzer in the middle of 1934 reports to Murat Trotsky that he organized the assassination of Voroshilov, for which purpose Schmidt was to be prepared, who therefore at the same time was not yet engaged to do the killing because Dreitzer recruited Schmidt only in 1935. So far, so good, but the state's attorney does not watch his dates because he declares that the testimony of Murat Trotsky and Dreitzer was also confirmed by the accused Reingold, who testified as follows. I learned from Murat Trotsky and Dreitzer that in the summer of 1933, a Trotskyite group of military men was organized under the leadership of Dreitzer. The group consisted of Schmidt, commander of a brigade of the Red Army, Kuzmichev, chief of staff of a military unit, and a number of other persons whose names I do not know. I learned from Dreitzer that Schmidt and Kuzmichev were to carry out personally the terroristic act against Voroshilov, and that they had agreed to do so. All these contradictions appear on the one and same page of the official printed report. So to sum up, Murat Trotsky, in conversation in the middle of 1934, learns that Dreitzer will engage Schmidt to assassinate Voroshilov sometime in the future. Dreitzer states that he engaged Schmidt only in 1935, but Reingold learns about Schmidt being in charge of the Voroshilov assassination already in 1933. This is what the state's attorney calls the investigation has established, and which must be just as truthful and just as well established as the state's attorney's further statement that the investigation has also established that in the same period, a number of terrorist groups were organized in attempts on the lives of other Soviet functionaries. If one counters that the patent contradiction is made by the accused and not by the prosecutor, one may answer that the purpose of the trial was to establish the facts by clearing up just such contradiction. The state's attorney, however, could not be bothered with such unimportant details. His job was to prove, by hook or crook, the Trotsky-Gestapo connection. All of these contradictions needed to be resolved for the prosecution to be allowed in any real court to move forward with a conviction. During the trial, much physical evidence is referenced, and although the accused habitually don't remember the names of their domestic and foreign connections, they are miraculously able to remember verbatim what was written on these destroyed letters years after they read them. For the supposed assassination attempt on Stalin at the 7th Congress of the Third International, it is stated that Berman Urin acquired a Browning revolver. What is the caliber? Not stated. It is simply a medium Browning revolver. Do you know how ridiculous that sounds? This weapon was smuggled into the USSR by Urin. He was the one who possessed the weapon intended to kill Stalin. Instead, he gives this weapon to Davis. And this is important, again, because Urin was not present at the event where Stalin was meant to die. Davis, who was present at the event, doesn't even try to go after his target. As far as I know, the court doesn't even bother to present the weapon. Lastly, let's talk about the Holtzman confession, with the discussion on the Hotel Bristol dispute. This is the one single time that Finnbol brings up a contradiction in the trial. And what does he say about it?
Since the Dewey Commission failed to provide any meaningful evidence of its own, they claim to have found holes in the charges made at the Moscow trial. Their case heavily rested on the so-called Hotel Bristol argument, which also has since been debunked. The argument goes as follows. One accused, Holtzman, testified to have met Leon Sedov in Copenhagen in a hotel named Bristol. The Dewey Commission claimed that the Hotel Bristol had previously burnt down, and therefore this was an impossibility and a lie invented by Stalinists. It has since been proven that actually Holtzman met Sedov in the Grand Hotel, the cafe bakery adjacent to which was called Bristol. Holtzman mistakenly thought Bristol was the name of the hotel, as the hotel had no other sign, other than the cafe sign that said Bristol. One wonders, does this sound like something the Soviet police would fabricate? No, it doesn't. It is overly convoluted for no apparent reason. What it does sound like is that Holtzman made an honest mistake.
Now, Finnbol, first of all, the Hotel Bristol argument is not the only contradiction in the trials. Yet it is the only one you mention because you falsely believe that it can be debunked. You relegated to just 2 paragraphs only one of the major issues that people took with the trials, and you say that it has been debunked. But by whom? Your source is Sven-Erik Holmström, yet you don't even mention him in your article, or add a footnote to your source. Shall you take the credit for this debunking yourself? Holmström wrote about Hotel Bristol in 2008, but in 2011, Mike Jones discussed Holmström's supposed new evidence. He writes, Steele Bille Larsen points out that Nielsen had to admit that no Hotel Bristol had existed since 1917, but that Conditori Bristol, a Viennese-style cafe that serves cake and coffee, situated next door to the Hotel Grand, could have caused the confusion. Nielsen claimed, and produced a sketch to illustrate it, that a door linked the hotel foyer with the Bristol. Steen Bille Larsen informs us that the Danish syndicalists, in their organ, Arbeidet, pointed out that the supposed door between the Café Bristol and the Grand Hotel was an iron door on the back stairs of the top floor of the building, strictly for the use of the fire service. Arbeidet also reported that a new English edition of the trial proceedings omitted the controversial section of Holtzmann's Bristol visit. Arne Munch Petersen, who later vanished in the Soviet Union, wrote a pamphlet, Fra Rettesen I Moskova, Copenhagen 1937, about the trials, in which he claimed that this Café Bristol was situated so in 1932 that it was in fact a part of the vestibule of the Grand Hotel in Copenhagen, which is on Vesterbrogade, just by the central station. Holmström has overlooked the pamphlet by Arne Munch Petersen, which is just as well as it contradicts Nielsen's claim about the interconnecting door by placing the Café Bristol inside the Grand Hotel. The fact that Arne Munch Petersen felt it necessary to write a pamphlet surely indicates a lack of confidence in Nielsen's explanation. Holmström reproduces bits of Krack's Vegeser, Copenhagen street plan, and the Copenhagen telephone directory to illustrate his argument. In his figure, he omits to mention that at the Vesterbrogade 9A, below Grand Hotel and before Bristol Conditori, is Den Gamle Bradeheit, the old log cabin which on the photos has a large sign saying "Eat cheaply." The proprietor, W.M. Ties, is also the proprietor of the Bristol Conditori, and his telephone number, Central 1827, is also one of 3 at Den Gamle Bradeheit. The Grand Hotel's proprietor was Axel Andersen, and the telephone number was Central 3600. Thus, in 1932, there does not appear to be any connection between the Grand Hotel and Bristol Conditori regarding ownership. So why would a door allow movement between the two, except for the iron fire door on the 5th floor back stairs mentioned by the syndicalist organ Arbeidet? The main entrance, as opposed to the side entrances on the Copenhagen Central Station, opens to Vesterbrogade. Even if the darkness prevented Holtzmann seeing the sign on the upper part of the Grand Hotel as shown in Figure 9, then he surely could see the sign Bristol was over the window of Conditori. He'd be familiar with the German Konditor, pastry cook, Konditorei, a cafe selling pastries. Also, Holmström informs us, in 1930, when the Grand Hotel changed from being a pension, the entrance between Den Gamle Bradehitte and Bristol Conditori was fitted with a marquee awning, as is very common. However, from the 1931 photograph, it is not possible to see whether it had the hotel's name on it. Such a marquee before the revolving door would surely be a clue that one was entering a hotel and not a conditori, and not a conditory beside it. An explanation as to why Holtzmann and the other defendants in the 3 Moscow show trials came up with ridiculous confessions is what happened to Danish arch-Stalinist Arne Munch Petersen, the Communist Party of Denmark's representative in the Comintern. He led the campaign against Trotsky's 1932 visit to Copenhagen, and on 16th February 1937 defended the Moscow trial at a meeting of 3,000 workers in Copenhagen, which he followed up in a tour of the country. Yet on July 29th, he was arrested in the night by the NKVD. There is no new evidence in Holmström's paper on the infamous Hotel Bristol, only Martin Nielsen's old article from the Communist Party of Denmark's daily paper and some old photographs which prove nothing. There was no Hotel Bristol, and the Bristol Conditori not only was not connected to the Hotel Grand next door, but would be difficult to mistake for a hotel. The NKVD agents who fabricated Holtzmann's statement blundered. There was a Hotel Bristol in Oslo. It was a common name, perhaps originating in Bristol's maritime history, but not in Copenhagen. It was an amateur fabrication job. Now, Holmström did write a response to Jones, which I will link below, along with his original text. However, I think Jones' refutation tells us all that we need to know. Even if Holmström is correct about Bristol, it doesn't account for the contradictions I've already mentioned. And my friends, I've skipped quite a few that Heisler has pointed out, but it also won't account for the ones that I'm still about to bring up. Let's talk about some more testimonies. Heisler talks about the confession of Bukharin. During the testimony of Bukharin, repeated reference is made to him as one of the absolutely reliable persons belonging to the center, though it is shown subsequently that he failed every time his co-conspirators relied upon him. Bukharin states that particularly intense terroristic activity was carried on in August 1932 and in the autumn of 1934. What these intense terroristic activities were is not brought out, but as it appears from further testimony, they did not go beyond some more conversation and outright talking. According to the state's attorney, Bakayev stated that in October 1934, an attempt on the life of Stalin was organized in Moscow under the direction of Kamenev, Evdokimov, and himself, in which he, Bakayev, took a direct part. The attempt failed. When the attempt failed, Bakayev went to Kamenev and told him about it. So there was, according to the state's attorney, an attempt upon the life of Stalin. This attempt failed, but the failure must have been such a colossal one that no one even knew anything about the attempt. No newspaper wrote about the attempt, nor about its failure. So Bakayev had to inform Kamenev that the attempt failed. When informed, the former vice chairman of the People's Commissariat said, "A pity. Let's hope that the next time we'll be more successful." This defendant, who is allegedly in direct charge of the Kirov assassination, relates his visit to Leningrad and his meeting with Levin, Mandelstam, Sositsky, Rumyanstev, Katolyanov, and Myasnikov in Levin's apartment, where he was introduced to Nikolaev. While in Leningrad, Bakayev learned that the so-called terrorist group, quote, had established a regular watch over Kirov and that Kirov was so well covered there would be no difficulty in killing him. He was also informed, and this time by Nikolaev, that the latter, quote, had succeeded in finding out the exact time when Kirov traveled from his apartment to the Smolny, that he could kill Kirov either near the Smolny or in the Smolny itself. But apparently, Nikolaev could not for years make up his mind whether to kill Kirov near or in the Smolny. Therefore, preparations took from 1932 to 1934. It was reported repeatedly by reliable newspapers that Nikolaev was a secretary of Kirov. In the testimony, however, nothing must appear concerning such relationship because if Nikolaev as a secretary had personal contact with Kirov, it would have been difficult for the state's attorney to explain the long delay between the so-called laying of the plan and its execution. Neither could it be explained why Nikolaev allegedly stated to Bakayev that he, quote, had tried to get an appointment with Kirov so as to shoot him, but had failed to get an appointment. One usually does not get an appointment with someone so as to shoot him. Next, let us see what is said by N. Luria. The testimony of N. Luria shows that he was another emissary of Trotsky who came to the USSR from Berlin, quote, on the special mission of the Trotskyist organization for the purpose of committing terroristic acts. If one listening to the testimonies should still have a lingering doubt as to the character of the Trotskyist organizations, Luria is made to state that, quote, the training of Trotskyist organizations given to me during all those years I spent in that organization in Germany, in the long run, reduced itself to arousing hatred towards Stalin and the leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. This witness was really ready to make a trial to attempt a terrorist act, because upon questioning by the president of the court, he states that he was armed during the period from September 1932 to the spring of 1933 and was planning to assassinate Voroshilov, so that you would have committed the terrorist act had a favorable moment offered itself. Why did you not succeed in doing so? We saw Voroshilov's car going down Front Street. It was traveling too fast. It was hopeless firing at the fast-running car. We decided that it was hopeless. Yes, it must have been hopeless, though it is not hopeless to present such evidence now in open court. These defendants must have had all kinds of bad intentions, because this witness, after finding it hopeless to shoot at Voroshilov's car, tried to meet Kaganovich or Ozhornikidze at Chelyabinsk and tried to commit a terrorist act against them. The record shows that, again, he failed to carry out his intention. There is much talk about practical steps the accused have taken to organize terroristic acts, but there are no details as to these acts. There is also a statement by the defendant that he, quote, took part in preparing an attempt on the life of Zhdanov, but no details are given as to the place, time, and factual matters. Nothing but naked, unverified statement. Testimony is permitted to go into evidence in the form of a declaration, as that a certain terroristic act was to have been committed. Whether it was committed, or whether it was to have been committed, or whether the act existed only in the imagination of the state's attorney is not brought out. The prosecutor is not concerned with anything but with the presentation of prejudicial, though unverified statements. Although no physical evidence is given, even though none of the contradictions are resolved, the state attorney concludes the case and gives a several-hour-long speech where he calls the defendants mad dogs of capitalism, liars and clowns, insignificant pygmies, and little dogs snarling at an elephant, among other things. And then the prosecution carries through with a conviction. The 16 defendants in the case of the Trotskyite Zinovievite terrorist center were Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, Grigory Yevdokimov, Ivan Bakayev, Sergei Matrovsky, Aryutonovich, Vagarshek Aryutonovich Tervergayan, Ivan Nikitich Smirnov, Yefim Dreitzer, Isaac Reingold, Richard Pickle, Edward Holtzman, Fritz David, Valentin Olberg, Conan, Behrman, Urin, Moise Leurier, and Nathan Leurier. When all 16 were found guilty, one of the things which the accused were charged with was, and I quote, trying to make an attempt on the lives of Stalin, Zhdanov, and others. Trying to make an attempt. Quite tragic. I certainly wish that Finnbol tried to make an attempt at creating a good video, but unfortunately, unlike the Trotskyite Zinovievite terrorist center, he would not be able to plead guilty to such a charge. After being indicted on the 14th of August, the accused were taken to trial between the 19th and 24th. They were then put to death mere hours after their conviction. A few months later, in 1937, following the implication of various others in the conspiracy by the now executed defendants, the world was given another set of trials. This time, we are presented with the case of the Parallel Anti-Soviet Trotskyist Center. Our accused members are Karl Radek, Grigory Sokolnikov, Yuri Pyatikov, M.S. Bogulavsky, J.A. Knyazev, L. Serebryakov, J.A. Lifshitz, A.A. Shestov, N.I. Muralov, V.V. Arnold, J.D. Turok, G.E. Pushin, J.N. Drobnis, B.O. Norkin, I.I. Gracia, S.A. Ratachek, and M.S. Stroilov. When before, Zinoviev and Kamenev, along with their other associates, only wished to cause damage to Soviet society, as well as assassinate the Soviet leadership, so that they may resume their roles as the leaders of the Soviet Union. We are now told in this trial that the accused wished to, and I quote, attempt to overthrow the Soviet government and restore capitalism, make a pact with the enemies of the USSR, Germany and Japan, for the purpose of provoking war, make plans for the invasion and seizure of Soviet territory by Germany and Japan, and to facilitate such invasion, engage in espionage in favor of those arch enemies of the USSR, commit acts of sabotage to weaken the Soviet state, and attempt to commit acts of terrorism, including the assassination of Soviet leaders. On this new state of affairs, Heisler writes, if one recalls the indictment against the August defendants, one sees that only the fifth point of the present indictment was leveled against Zinoviev and the 16 others. If one further recalls that from among the present defendants, at least 3, Radek, Sokolnikov, and Serebryakov, were designated as leaders of the Zinoviev conspiracy, one is confronted with a riddle, hard if not impossible to solve, i.e., how is it possible that neither Zinoviev or any of his 16 co-defendants mentioned any of the first 4 charges of the present indictment? Is it possible that Radek, Sokolnikov, and Serebryakov kept their co-conspirators, Zinoviev and Kamenev, in the dark concerning the military plans of Japan and Germany? Did the present defendants do all their sabotaging without the help of Byakev, Mrachowski, and others sent for conspiracy in August? Did Radek, Sokolnikov, and Serebryakov do their espionage for Japan without the knowledge of Zinoviev and Kamenev, their co-leaders in the conspiracy? These and other questions must be answered before it is possible to give any kind of evaluation of the present trial. Now let us talk about these new defendants. Firstly, Trotsky is alleged to have met someone named Rom. Where did he meet Rom? A dark alley, of course. For what purpose? To become a Trotsky's agent in Washington. Why did Trotsky want Rom to become an agent, and what did he do as Trotsky's agent in Washington? Vyshinsky feels no need to answer that question. On Rom, Heisler writes, Rom is a man of mystery, who acted as no other human being would. He confessed that he had been one of the conspirators and go-betweens from Radek to Trotsky for the past 4 or 5 years. He was reasonably safe from arrest and subsequent execution in the USA, as the correspondent for Izvestia. He confessed knowledge of the conspiracy to murder Kirov. He had read about the Kirov trial and the discovery of the conspiracy in 1935. He learned about the discovery of further details of this conspiracy and the trial of Zinoviev and Kamenev. He even read about Radek, his chief's implication through the testimony of Kamenev. He was informed as to how alleged conspirators such as Zinoviev and Kamenev are dealt with in the USSR. Is it logical to assume that he knew what his own fate would be if his role as a conspirator were discovered while in the territory of the USSR? Nevertheless, Rom, in the fall of 1936, leaves the safe haven of Washington, D.C. and goes to Moscow. Is there one other man besides Rom who, knowing of his guilt, would return and testify against himself? All these occurrences are suspicious. But to Finnbol, it's no matter, and he simply takes the accused words as they are, with no criticism of the many holes we have already covered, either because they do not bother him, because with his so-called analysis he doesn't know him, or because he never read the court transcript in the first place. Next, Pyatikov is supposed to have taken a flight to Oslo from Berlin in 1935 to meet with Trotsky. On this, Heisler writes, first of all, Pyatikov holding down the job of Vice Commissar for Heavy Industries, must have left the USSR without knowledge of the government and of the all-knowing GPU. Secondly, as a Soviet official, he must have been in Hitler's Berlin in December 1935 without the knowledge of the Hitler government and of the all-knowing Gestapo. Pyatakov, a Soviet official of primary importance, left by airplane the Nazi-controlled Tempelhof airfield without anyone knowing about it, and arrived in Oslo without coming to the attention of the Norwegian government. He must have gone from Oslo to Hønefoss without being spotted or recognized by anyone. Pyatakov, the stranger, must have gone to the village of Vexel, and there must have found the home of Knudsen without being met or seen by anyone. And there, he was able to interview Trotsky for 2 hours. But that is only one of half of the things like that which were arranged. Pyatakov was forced to retrace his steps from Vexel to Hønefoss, and from there to Oslo, from Oslo to Berlin, and finally from Berlin to Moscow. And he did things like that without ever being noticed by the police or Norway or by Hitler's Gestapo or by Stalin's GPU. That the story is made up is proved by the report of 2 Oslo papers, the Aftenposten and the Dagbladet, both of which report that their checkup at the Oslo airport shows no such landing as that confessed to by Pyatakov. Apparently, Pyatakov is to have spawned in Norway without anyone knowing, so that he may have received even more terrorist instructions from Trotsky. Genuinely ask yourself, if Pyatakov was involved, why did he need to go meet Trotsky in 1935, the year after Kirov was assassinated, the worst possible time for him to go and secretly meet Trotsky? If all of these people were in league together, why do they need to keep meeting Trotsky? Trotsky's terrorist instructions date all the way back to 1932, back to 1930 even. Yet these people just sit on their ass for years and repeatedly meet with Trotsky just so he can tell them to do the same thing that they were told to do years ago? Are these people so incompetent that they can't formulate an assassination plot? Are these people so incompetent that they can't formulate an assassination plot on their own, that they must meet with Trotsky at every moment to go and coordinate with their plan? And what exactly was their plan? We are told that the Trotskyists wished to weaken the USSR by means of terrorism and sabotage, and that in actual fact that they did, despite simultaneously having very few supporters. We are told by J.A. Kniazev, who was chief of the Soviet Southern Railways, that he engineered 3,500 train wrecks in the span of 2 years. As Heisler writes, that's a total of 5 train wrecks every single day. Heisler continues, this average of 5 train wrecks a day must be understood as having been caused by Kniazev in his own territory, i.e., the territory of the Southern Railway, which is a small part of the USSR. Such an incredible number of train wrecks was caused by no one else than the manager of the railway himself. How did he do it? How many thousands of helpers did he have? Where are those handy helpers? Did Kniazev do nothing else but wreck trains for 2 years? Did he ever go to his managerial office? Or was he always on the road doing his train wrecking? Was his time not pretty well taken up by an average of 5 train wrecks daily? And you have to understand that this is not substantial, and these are not anecdotal arguments, but genuine questions that fundamentally need to be answered. In the United States, there are apparently 1,800 train accidents nationally every year, and we are now told that in the USSR there has been that same amount, but all of those have been train wrecks, and they've only been relegated to one area of the country? That all of these occurred in one director's section and no action was taken prior to the trials? And how did the director organize these wrecks anyway? Vyshynski or Finnbol knows. One of the accused, Shestov, is said to have carried dynamite with an unnamed German engineer to blow up his own mine. And this plot was of course foiled, because, they always are. And how was this plot foiled exactly? Some children found the dynamite, began to play with it, and they blew themselves up. How Shestov got the dynamite to the mine without anyone noticing, or how and why these kids are at a mine and somehow managed to ignite the dynamite without percussion caps. And Vyshynski is unaware that dynamite can't explode without blasting caps, which initiate the reaction in the nitroglycerin. All of this is not discussed at all in the trial. My friends, by this point, you must notice that, curiously, most of these plots are cartoonishly foiled or never come about. There are always plans, yet they never come to fruition. By some miracle, the angel David comes and saves Stalin and his friends from all these plots. Except for Kirov. We are truly dealing with some Looney Tunes ass terrorists, aren't we? In fact, we are even given quite a Looney Tunes plot to murder Molotov. Heisler writes, this same Shestov confessed to many other no less fantastic plans, but plans they remained, none of them ever ripening into acts. The reason was, as Shestov put it, that, quote, all the conspirators lacked nerve. Lack of nerve did, according to Arnold's testimony, save the life of Prime Minister Molotov. Arnold, as agreed by the conspirators, was to sacrifice himself to murder Molotov. He volunteered as Molotov's chauffeur and was to drive the car over a precipice. Some of the co-conspirators did not trust Arnold, and therefore they followed Molotov in a truck in case of an expected nerve failure on the part of Arnold. The truck was to push the car over the precipice, but let's have Arnold's story. I drove the car towards the precipice, and the truck following me passed by, the others in the truck thinking that I shall drive over the cliff. Afterwards, I lost my nerve and turned back to the road. All acts of sabotage to be committed by high officials of the USSR. How impossible such a plot is one can see easily by transferring the scene to another country. How could, e.g., the Secretary of Commerce or of the Interior in the USA bring about 3,500 train wrecks in 2 years or even in 200 years? How could such things be accomplished here without the help of thousands of co-conspirators? Can such sabotage be accomplished by the top alone? We could go on endlessly, but these stories are always the same. Plans with many trimmings, blood-curdling episodes, all described in detail, never carried out. Lifshitz, a former vice commissar of railways, confessed to every one of the charges. So did Sokolnikov, the former vice commissar of foreign affairs, and so did Pyatakov, Pushin, former chemistry official, Karl Radek, J.N. Drobnis, former leading functionary of the Moscow Soviet, M.S. Bogulavsky, high functionary of the Commissariat for Industry, and former member of the Moscow Soviet. Planned they did for years, but the plots were bungled because, as Arnold put it, they lost their nerve. Plans, always plans, not action. The result, however, is the pronouncement of the court handed down on January 30th, 1937. All defendants were found guilty and sentenced to die, with the exception of Radek, Sokolnikov, Arnold, and Stroilov. The date of January 30th must become a double holiday for Hitler in Germany. It was the anniversary of Hitler's taking power, and now there is additional reason for celebration. The liquidation of the old Bolsheviks continues apace. I repeat to you once more that the plots never came to fruition. The terrorists are always planning always, but never acting. Leitis and Bernau write, the image of not quite successful conspiracy thus showed the conspirators to be incessantly organizing something or other. A variety of phrases were used to describe this. Setting to work to organize, forming a bloc, forming a center, leading a group, directing activities, conducting negotiations, and coming to an agreement with some enemy, uniting forces, getting in touch with somebody, establishing contact, and then being in direct contact with someone, receiving instructions or giving them, holding a secret conference, and drawing up a platform, making practical preparations for some act or another, entrusting somebody with practical directions of certain acts, deciding to expedite some act, checking up on the situation somewhere, and on the progress of preparations. This allegedly went on for years, during which, as Wyszynski said in his peroration at the third trial, the Bloc systemically and pedantically devoted itself to terrorism. Shackman points out that, according to Oberg, early in 1933, the Trotskyist Gestapo alliance began, yet early in 1935, the Trotskyists now stand before the dilemma of dissolving or uniting with the Gestapo. Thus, the conspirators milled around on the same spot for years, concerned with the same task. That is, they represented an image of a type of Russian behavior rejected by Bolshevik doctrine. The only alleged success of these protracted and intense efforts presented in the first trial were the murders of Kirov and of Zinoviev's secretary, Bogdan, which was an enforced suicide. There are only a few elliptical and ambiguous references to overt attempts which were unsuccessful. And mind you, these are only the public trials. Many more were killed without the same spectacle. As Leitis and Burnout point out, we also had Antipov, Antonov Ovsinko, Bubnov, I can't pronounce that name, Frumkin, Karakan, Kinchuk, Krylenko, Medvedev, V. Mezlauk, Milyutin, Postashev, Preobrazhensky, Ryazanov, Ryutin, Rudzatak, Safarov, Sapranov, Shlapnikov, Smilga, V. Smirnov, Sosnovsky, Sirtstov, Uglanov, Unchlit, Varansky, Yenikudze, Yurinev, Zalutsky, and many more who were executed. Some of the accused, like Karl Radek and Grigory Sokolnikov, managed to evade execution and were instead given lengthy prison sentences. They confessed in court, But the moment they got to prison, they went around telling everyone that they didn't actually do it and that they lied in their testimonies. It was decided they needed to go. Radek and Sokolnikov were killed in prison by the NKVD in the same month, literally 2 days apart. Radek died on May 19th, 1939, and Sokolnikov was killed on the 21st. Is that not absurdly suspicious? Heisler has done a sufficient job of showing the contradictions and the absurdities in the trials that Finnbol states weren't there, yet I've just shown a dozen. And if you think that those aren't contradictions, then you... Oh my god. It is up to Finnbol to show that the holes in the story are indeed not holes. But will he? Can he? Finnbol is not the first person to defend the trials, and he has also taken to demonstrate that observers noted how fair the trials were. However, who were these observers? I can name two for you. The British lawyer and Labour MP D.N. Pritt, as well as the American ambassador to the USSR, J.E. Davies. Also, I must mention that before I wrote this segment of my video, I had not watched his second video. Initially, I refused to watch any of his other videos because I was so utterly horrified by the first. Yet, in my writing, I noticed I made a bunch of statements that I couldn't verify. For example, I claimed that he didn't bring up the Dewey Commission, but then I understood that perhaps I shouldn't say something I blatantly don't know. So I checked up on his second video, and I do discover that he did briefly discuss the Dewey Commission for 4 minutes at the end of the video. I see that also, lo and behold, he made use of Pritt and Davies as sources to prove to us that the trials were fair. And going through your website, I also come across another, one Pat Sloan. Now, certainly, these people are objective sources. We have amongst ourselves a liberal British lawyer and an American who worked for the State Department. Unfortunately for Finnbol, no, not at all. If anything, Finnbol chose these sources because he knew they weren't objective. Unlike when Finnbol talks about Tokaev and Zinoviev, he fails to give us a background check on who any of these people are and treats them as though they're just random people unconnected to the trial. But both Davies and Pritt were just examples of those many liberal, halfway Stalinist fellow travelers of the 1930s, and Pat Sloan was a member of the British-Soviet Friendship Society. These people, like the Trotskyists, are not unbiased. The information that you use is biased. It can't be trusted. And with Pritt, he wasn't just anybody. In fact, he was well known for being an uncritical supporter of Stalin during his time. He was literally kicked out of the Labour Party for being too pro-Soviet. Pritt certainly gave a great contribution to anti-fascism when he assisted in the defense of Dimitrov in 1933 in a counter-trial. But in 1936, he succumbed to apologia. Friedrich Adler demonstrates Pritt's sycophancy quite well. The first statements made by Pritt were bound to produce the greatest astonishment, since he drew all his conclusions solely from what the spectator sees in court, and did not make the slightest reference to the fact that there might also be problems which lie behind the scenes. In the preliminary investigation, not until he had been driven on to the defensive by his critics did he get into the real problems in his last pamphlet. We must therefore consider the two phases of Pritt's defense of what happened in Moscow separately. During the first phase, Pritt entirely repeats how courteous the president of the court and the public prosecutor were in their treatment of the defendants. They are not interrupted, even when they speak at great length. The only thing that seems odd to the English mind is that the public applauds the speech of State Attorney Vyshinsky and that no attempt is made to prevent the applause. But where there is no jury, this cannot do much harm. It is clear that if the untruthfulness of even a single admission is shown, the whole artificial structure of probabilities which Pritt operates collapses. As we have already shown, there were the demonstrably false admissions in the Menshevik trial of 1931 on the journey of Abramovich to Russia, and in the last trial, there is the demonstrably false admission as to what happened in the non-existent Hotel Bristol at Copenhagen. Pritt makes no mention whatever these facts, but he writes a preface to an edition of the report of the court proceedings in which the British public is guarded against learning anything of the testimony which can easily be proved to be a false confession. In this report, the passage from Holtzman's confession with regard to Hotel Bristol is simply omitted. Anyone who wishes to convince himself of the contrary of the edition of the report of the court proceedings published under Pritt's auspices, which he prefaces with the recommendation that a perusal of it will enable anyone to inform adequately of the course of the trial, should compare page 49 of his edition with page 100 of the English edition published by the People's Commissariat Justice of the USSR. We are quite convinced that Pratt did not delete this passage himself, and that he assumed in good faith the responsibility for the cuts made by the editor of this edition. But the deletion is so striking, we are unfortunately compelled to assume that the editor of this report of the trial was aware of the business of the Hotel Bristol. which had meanwhile become widely known as a result of information published in the Copenhagen Social Democraten. When Finnbol states, quote, other foreign visitors to the USSR voiced similar opinions, it is Pritt and Sloan that he cites directly, and only these two. Now on Davies. Davies, like Pritt, is also not a reliable source. Once more, Davies himself was rather pro-Soviet. Like a lot of liberals in the 1930s, he held a favorable view of the USSR, and during his time in the USSR, he became enamored in its new and progressive culture. It is also important to note the FDR administration, especially after Operation Barbarossa, took a pro-Soviet stance. Once the war started, the U.S. State Department halted its anti-Soviet propaganda and started pushing pro-Soviet propaganda. They even turned Davies' book Mission to Moscow into a film, for Christ's sake. And long before the war, FDR himself referred both to Stalin and Mussolini as his blood brothers. When Davies first witnessed the Moscow trials in person in 1937, he considered them to be bizarre. Yet, 4 whole years later, Davies in his book claims that, after reviewing the evidence, that the trials were actually perfectly fair, and that the accused were indeed guilty. Why does he think they were fair? Because, from studying the accused faces, they looked quite guilty. Isn't it quite curious that the moment that the Soviet Union was invaded by the Germans, that Davies all of a sudden realizes what the truth was? It is political chicanery and real politics that influences Davies, not a thorough and objective view of the facts. But if this is not enough for you to be convinced, let us take a closer look at Davies' objective observation through the excellent work of Dominique Petit, who wrote a whole dissertation on the topic of Davies and the U.S. press corps in Moscow in the 1930s.
The first of these show trials had occurred the previous summer in August 1936, before Davies' appointment as ambassador, giving the relatively inexperienced diplomat virtually no time to read up on the charges and prepare for daily trial attendance. Following a full day of attendance at the Radic Trotskyist conspiracy trial, which Davies clearly did not yet know how to interpret as he simply recorded what he witnessed without any personal commentary, Davies chose to invite the boys of the U.S. press corps to come over to his residence half an hour after the trial adjourned at 10:30 p.m. for beer and sandwiches to hash over the trial. Furthermore, as Davies struggled upon his arrival to make sense of both the show trials and Soviet society, he was particularly open to influence from those whose opinions he clearly valued most, such as the boys in the press corps. As Davies did not speak any Russian, he was entirely reliant upon translators to interpret the daily show trial proceedings for him. Davies' primary translators were Kennan and press interpreters fluent in Russian, namely Barnes and Shapiro, who gave Davies the gist of the testimony. Thus, Davies' perception of the show trials was heavily influenced by the impressions of those around him, notably the American press. In attendance at all 3 show trials and residing in the USSR over an extended period of time, American diplomats and journalists were not mere observers. Rather, American members of the press corps and their close friend Ambassador Davies became embedded in Soviet society, not only observing, but also participating in socialist realist culture. Barnes and Duell were among 30 foreign correspondents who were invited to observe Stalin's 3 major show trials. Following lengthy evening discussions alone with Ambassador Davies and the remainder of the close-knit American press corps in the U.S. Embassy, most American journalists departed from largely more skeptical European observations of the trials to conclude that there was merit to the charges. For example, the British journalist Alfred Sholerton of the Daily Telegraph remarked to Davies that he believed everything but the facts, while an Austrian reporter for Die Neue Freie Presse believed it would be necessary to return to the Middle Ages to find a similar fervent longing for execution. Writing for the Australian Quarterly in 1937, Francis C. Hudley, an expert in jurisprudence, also cast serious doubt upon the validity of the charges, arguing, "There is no reason for believing in the guilt of any of the other major defendants than there is for believing in the guilt of Trotsky himself." Hudley further noted that the mixing of the guilty and the innocent was a favorite device of the architects of faked trials. Overall, Western European and Australian accounts of the show trials were overwhelmingly dismissive of most charges. Max Radin, an American legal analyst who believed there was probably merit in the prosecution's case, wrote for Foreign Affairs in October 1937 that, quote, "The foreign comment on the trials has been in the main highly unfavorable to the prosecution. informed by lingering 19th century notions of Russia's Asiatic backward national character, Davies and the newsmen presented the most confounding aspects of the show trials as inherently Asian, psychologically different than Western minds, and thus unintelligible. As both Davies and the American correspondents regularly noted the perceived strangeness and bizarreness of the show trials, confused by the seemingly endless parade of detailed confessions that were certain to lead the majority of the accused to face a firing squad, their analysis frequently hinged on the strange and incomprehensible. Consequently, both Davies and Duell, and to a lesser extent Barnes, described the bizarre proceedings as they witnessed them, foregoing any more prodding attempts at unraveling the true motivation behind the trials and the astonishing confessions they elicited. As they reasoned that Russian psychology and Soviet power struggles were, as Davies concluded in a 1937 letter to the Assistant Secretary of State, incomprehensible to us. This assumption that Soviet society was incomprehensible and simply could not be demystified by American observers echoed the underlying late 19th century idea that perceived the Russians as Asian and thus inherently different from Western societies. While pondering the Soviet judicial theory that compelled defendants to testify in a court once a prima facie case had been established, Davies sought to account for Soviet inconsistencies in legal proceedings by blaming Russian psychology. Davies thus described this peculiar Russian psychology in a letter home to a colleague as the imponderable factor in the equation, for Russian psychology is different from ours, certainly. Inextricably linked to this understanding of Russian psychology was the idea that the Russian populace was overwhelmingly backwards, applying long-standing Western prejudices against perceived Russian backwardness to his analysis of the show trials. Barnes argued that heavy turnover in the executive personnel of the Communist Party can be understood only in its Russian context against the background of human backwardness with which the Communists have had to struggle in their own ranks. Barnes's use of the word backwardness is significant, as it paints the Bolsheviks in a central modernizing role. Building upon visions of a backwards populace, Duell labeled Russian psychology and revolutionary fanaticism as incomprehensible. This was best expressed when Duell reported on the third show trial for UP in 1938. The trial tends to bring out under conditions almost incomprehensible to the Western mind because of Russian psychology, strange revolutionary fanaticism, and ideology and Soviet procedure. The story of an underground struggle for control of the richest and largest slice of the world's area under any government. Differentiating between Western and Russian psychology, Duell suggested that Russians were either mentally conditioned differently or ethnically apart from members of Western society, thereby presenting an impenetrable barrier between the Western world and Soviet Eastern society that precluded American observers from ever understanding any underlying motives for the trials. Davies was influenced by his press team. On his press team were the likes of Walter Duranty and Joseph Barnes, who were both liberals who supported Stalin and were fascinated by Soviet modernization and industrialization. Davies is not only not objective, his view and the view of his associates is in part influenced and created by their racist worldview. They think the trials don't make sense. In order to make sense of them, they have to bring up this non-existent distinction between American and Russian psychologies. It is a racist view, and thus it is not a view that can be relied on in good faith. Furthermore, other foreign observers that weren't Pritt and Davies were indeed quite confused, just as Duranty was. Heisler writes, some of the foreign correspondents present at the trial were wondering how it came that during the Kirov trial in January 1935, the alleged facts, as now presented, were not known. It is strange that such material parts of the story were then unknown, and still stranger that important events did not take place until months after the earlier trial. The reporters were wondering, and the state's attorney must have wondered about the same thing. They must have tried to find an answer to the question when he declared to an end for Evdokimov. At the trial in Leningrad on January 15th to 16th, 1935, when facing the courts as you do now, you emphatically asserted that you had nothing to do with that murder. At that time, you told untruths? Yes, I deceived the court. You thought you deceived the court. As a matter of fact, the deception did not work. Now it is exposed. Yes. Apparently, Evdokimov agreed at last that crime does not pay. He was willing to agree with the state's attorney, though it took 18 months or longer in prison before he was brought to that conclusion. After 18 or more months in prison, the state's attorney may call upon the accused to join in and make the confession an almost unanimous one. Something that we must also consider about these so-called objective observers is that while they are witnesses inside the court, they are not full witnesses of the political realities of the Soviet Union. We have this thing called hindsight. As much as a first-person source is present at an event, there are things that they miss that secondary sources are required to clarify or fill in. For example, in Louise Bryant's Mirrors of Moscow, Stalin is not mentioned once. In Jack London's 10 Days That Shook the World, Stalin is a minor figure. Does that mean that definitively Stalin was not important during the revolution? Contrary to what the Trotskyists would want you to believe, this is not the case. Just as Trotsky was important to Lenin, so was Stalin, even if contemporary propaganda and sources from the time does not fully reflect that. Through hindsight analysis and with secondary sources, we can learn who was where, doing what, and so on and so forth. These are things that these so-called observers couldn't have known when making their already biased judgments. I don't care about these people's opinions on the matter, and all of these sources that Finnbol cites as examples of what people who deemed the trials to be fair, they never stated why, simply that they witnessed them, and that's all they needed. What is an opinion when we have the facts? And Finnbol mentions rather quickly that many mainstream media outlets thought the trials were fair. Finnbol, how many is many? This is a vague statement, and you back it up by citing only one newspaper. Is that not ridiculous? Not only does he cite only one paper, it is from 1936, and that is only after the first trial. He writes, despite the fact that some bourgeois outlets wanted to portray the trials as a hoax, many mainstream media outlets were eventually forced to admit the trials were fair. This is contrary to the truth, because by the time the third and most ridiculous trial occurred, the same media which accepted the first trial was left scratching their heads. Hugo de Waard demonstrates an example. The verdict of the British press was in general unfavorable to the Moscow trials. Among the dailies, the Manchester Guardian stood out as their sharpest critic. Typical of the Manchester Guardian's attitude was its statement of 28 August 1936. He surrounds himself with men of his own making and devotes all the power of the state to removing those who, however remotely, might become rival centers of authority. Nothing as bluntly condemnatory as this came, however, from the Times. Indeed, in 1936 and 1937, its attitude might justly be construed as favorable to Stalin. The trials, it thought, reflected the triumph of Stalin's nationalist policy over that of the revolutionary diehards. The conservative forces, with the overwhelming support of the nation, had now demonstrably gained the day. It was only with the 1938 trial that the Times expressed doubts as to the general trend of affairs in the Soviet Union. On balance, one cannot say that the Times saw very clearly in this matter. Stalin's policy of nationalism has been amply vindicated. Russia has made much industrial progress. Social conditions are improving. Today, the Russian dictatorship stages what is evidently meant to be the most impressive and terrifying of its many exhibitions of despotic power. The customary overture has already been played by the Soviet press, howling for the blood of those whom it denounces in the grimly prophetic phrase, as this Trotskyist carrion. We also see that among the many media commentators on the trials, the fascist white emigre outlets give the trials lavish praise. In a Paris emigre newspaper, we find, "We thank thee, Stalin. 16 scoundrels, 16 butchers of the fatherland have been gathered to their ancestors. Today, the sky looks blue. Thou hast repaid us for the sorrows of many years. But why only 16? Give us 40. Give us hundreds, thousands. Make a bridge across the Moscow River, a bridge with towers or beams, a bridge of Soviet carrion, and add thy carcass to the rest." And Stalin did indeed give them thousands. Truly, you have to ask that if the Soviets wanted to prove definitively, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Trotskyists were in league with both the Japanese and the Germans, why didn't they do so immediately after the war? The Dewey Commission and even Trotsky's wife specifically asked to have such a confirmation take place at the Nuremberg trials with an examination of Rudolf Hess, who allegedly was in bed with Trotsky. Yet no such thing happens. As Brian Pierce writes in a footnote, at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, the Soviet representatives conspicuously refrained from asking Hess about his alleged anti-Soviet negotiations with Trotsky. In March 1946, a number of prominent British people signed an appeal to the tribunal, asking that Trotsky's widow be allowed to interrogate Hess in order to clear her husband's name, or that at least the Allied experts examining Gestapo records make a statement showing to what extent they had found confirmation of the story told in the Moscow trials. No action was taken on these requests, and to this day, no evidence of Nazi Trotskyite negotiations has been published. Throughout this video, I have avoided using Trotskyist evidence from the likes of Sedov, Shachtman, or Rogovin. I've done so because I firstly knew that the moment I sourced one, you would say that it was Trotskyite jibber jabber and click off the video. But secondly, because people do not need Trotskyist history to prove you wrong. I have cited some Trotskyists like Brian Pierce and Hugo de Waard, but that's because they have brought up good points. You wish to dispose of Trotskyist history, yet you at no point discuss their points. Sedov, Shakhtrin, Rogovin, and Brue have all written on the trials, but you haven't engaged with any of their talking points, nor do you even present their specific claims or arguments. You have cited Sedov's Red Book, so I assumed you have read it, but you don't engage with or bring up any of his arguments. In your second video, you bring up the Dewey Commission. However, you only relegate it to the end of your video and give it only 4 minutes of time, and most of it is you reading a quote by that one member who decided to leave. Finnbol, that commission is hundreds of pages long and composed of 2 books worth of material. All you have to say about it is that it's been debunked? By whom? Who was it debunked by? When was it debunked? Why don't you explain how it was debunked? Can't you talk about it? Did you read it? You note that some of the members of the Dewey Commission felt compelled to leave because they felt that many of its members were Trotsky sympathizers. This is all well and good. I'm glad that you showed that there was a problem with the Dewey Commission. Yet, is it not strange that you uncritically source pro-Stalin liberals whilst also failing to mention that they are in fact fellow travelers and therefore subject to bias? Do you not see the contradiction? Trotskyist sympathizers can't be trusted, but Soviet fellow travelers can? You mentioned these people who decided to leave the Dewey Commission, but you failed to mention some of its members who stayed, such as the anarchist Karlo Truska and the council communist Otto Rula, a man who despised Bolshevism and Trotsky. He even stated to Trotsky's face that he was the worst Stalinist of them all. Trotsky slaughtered the anarchists in Ukraine, and Trotsky was a principal agent in getting the German left communists removed from the Third International. These two were the last ones to be sympathetic to him. Furthermore, in your extremely short discussion of the Dewey Commission, you say that it was filled with Trotskyist propaganda, and that, within his testimonies, Trotsky was inflating his role in the Russian Revolution. I don't care to talk about whether or not Trotsky was important in the Russian Revolution. In fact, I shouldn't even have to, but I have to ask, between Stalin and Trotsky, who was it who was removing the other from photographs? Finnbol writes, I think anyone interested in the trial should read the material. The material convincingly shows the guilt of the oppositionists, and any honest and critical reader should conclude the trials were accurate and bona fide. It is quite natural that the main tactic of the anti-communists is to discourage people from reading the materials, and instead to spread lies and caricatures about them. Finnbol makes it seem that in the 90 years since the trial took place, that no one has ever read the materials, but since he actually took to reading the court proceedings, his eyes were open, and he suddenly realized the truth. However, Finnbol also says that the materials are filled with details, and that he can't possibly deal with them. Finnbol was not able to, but Heister was. What did Mao say? No investigation, no right to speak. You have done no investigation, and therefore you cannot speak on the trials. As someone who gives glamorous self-praise about how he truly understands the trials and looks beyond the veneer of Trotskyist lies, somehow, in none of your videos and in none of your essays do you mention Fritz David. In the hour of my time that you wasted, you don't mention Berman Urin, you don't mention Bakayev, you don't mention VP Olberg, you don't mention M. Luria, you don't mention N. Luria, you don't mention Dreitzer, you do not mention this supposed Weitz, whose literal existence can't be verified. I'm serious. Look him up. You're only going to get taken to a transcript of the Moscow trials. You only mention Holtzman a few times at the end of your second video, and only in connection to Hotel Bristol, using a source which you don't identify, but which I have shown has been refuted. You don't even make an attempt to refute the Oslo flight story. In fact, you don't even bring it up. In your defense against the counter-arguments by the Trotskyists, you rely only on Pritt and the media coverage from the bourgeois press. The former, we have already demonstrated, is not a reliable or objective source. Finally, despite having an hour and a half of my time, you barely even discuss the trial itself. How is it that in a video on the trials, you fail to name the majority of the defendants and fail to mention what they were accused of? Why are we talking about Khrushchev and Gorbachev? Talk about the trial! In your essay called Analyzing the Moscow Trials, you spend more time talking about the accused history with Lenin or their own political history, such as Bukharin's evolution from left communism to defender of the NEP. For example, you write, firstly, the status of the defendants as old Bolsheviks is dubious at best. They had all committed various acts of treachery against Lenin, been in opposition to Lenin on countless occasions, for many years, or even the majority of their careers, had opposed Lenin and Bolshevism in countless ways. Secondly, many of the defendants had engaged in acts very similar to those accused at the trials, already in the past, but usually, though not always, in less severe forms. Finnbol is telling us that the old Bolsheviks weren't actually old Bolsheviks because, periodically, they took stances against Lenin, while Stalin and his crew represent the real Bolshevik old guard. They are, quote, old Bolsheviks, not just in name, but in substance as well. Finnbol isn't the first person to try this line of argumentation either. Brian Pierce writes, the campaign to justify Stalin's purges and to make the utmost political capital out of them, was raised to a higher level and put on more organized basis than hitherto by John Golan. In his address to the enlarged meeting of the National Council of the Young Communist League held on January 30th to 31st, the historical rewrite, adumbrated by Ralph Fox, was undertaken more thoroughly and at some length by Golan. The address was published as a duplicated document under the title The Development of Trotskyism from Menshevism to Alliance with Fascism and Counter-Revolution. Golan showed how Lenin's chief assistant in building the Red Army was not Trotsky, but Stalin. How Trotsky had advocated the industrialization be carried out at the expense of the peasant masses, saved by Stalin, etc., etc. This remarkable assemblage of half-troops and untroops concluded with a list of the real Bolshevik old guard, in which figures the names of Rudzutak, Bubnov, Chubar, Kosier, and Postashev, all shot or imprisoned by Stalin shortly afterwards. Harry Pollitt went one better than this in his list of the real old guard, who are still at their posts, by including the name of Yezhov, whom hardly anybody, probably not Pollitt himself, had even heard of until his sudden elevation in September 1936 to be head of the NKVD following Yagola's fall. I am about to give you a slideshow of people who were very clearly prominent officials in the Bolshevik Party, since their portraits are depicted in this Soviet photo book. A red X over them means that they were executed. If they have a date over their name, that's the year when they died of natural causes or some other reason that wasn't execution. If they have no date, they were still alive past 1941, but some of them do die in the 1940s of natural causes. Finnbol also has the audacity to write down that the accused were, quote, lifelong professional underground conspirators with a track record of similar acts. Similar acts, he says? Dear viewer, if you don't see what is wrong with a supposed communist saying something like that, I can't help you. Reading a sentence like that, I would have thought I was reading a CIA document and not something written by someone who calls himself a Bolshevik. In fact, one of Davies' associates, Ralph Barnes, says the same thing, almost verbatim, when he wrote that the men accused at the trial had been, quote, conspirators against constituted authority from the days of their adolescence under the Tsar, and therefore it was, quote, understandable that they should be compelled to follow their trade even after it had brought them to the high seats of the new authority. Ridiculous! You talk so much about how you actually read the material, but you put up a tragically small effort to engage with said material when whole books were written that engaged with the court transcripts that themselves were hundreds of pages long. I will admit, I don't know much about the law, which is why I relied heavily on Heisler, since he was a lawyer, and did indeed read the transcripts. You interpret, quite oddly, statements by Getty and Tokaev. You repeatedly reference the 1932 Bloc as if it's this damning ace in the hole, when in fact it means very little. Finnbol's sources barely make reference to the trial itself, and mostly talk about the personalities of the accused. And as I've stated, he barely mentions the people actually connected with the trial. He never even tells you that the state attorney, Vyshinsky, was a Menshevik in 1917, who, while working with the provisional government, tried to have Lenin arrested. But he'll bring up Alexander Zinoviev, who literally has nothing to do with the trials. Finnbol, if your wish is to disprove the Trotskyist narrative, why don't you do so? I repeat once more that in this hour-long video, you failed completely to highlight or combat any of their specific claims. If by some chance you respond to this video, don't respond to me, respond to them. To prove the validity of the trials, to prove the evidence wasn't contradictory, you must firstly prove Franz Weitz was a real person. You must prove Olberg was in contact with Trotsky. You must prove that Pyatakov flew to Oslo and met Trotsky, and not with a confession, but with evidence. You have to prove that Holtzman met Sedov in Copenhagen. You have to prove that Trotsky met Berman in Copenhagen. You have to prove that Trotsky met David in Copenhagen. You have to prove that Trotsky met Vladimir Rom. You must prove with more than just witness statements that at any moment these people had weapons and made actual attempts on the lives of Zhdanov, Vorshilov, Molotov, and Stalin. This is what you must prove. You must prove that all of these meetings occurred, because if you can't, then the case, which relies solely on these testimonies taking place, completely breaks down. In court cases, if an accused person cannot be placed at a scene that he is stated to be at for the charges he is accused of, then the case begins to lose its validity. It is on you to prove these claims. You might say, the Trotskyite conspirators obviously destroyed the evidence. That's quite convenient. But it does not convince anyone who takes this sort of thing seriously. Even if by some miracle you prove that every single one of the accused was connected with the Germans and the Japanese, which I already know you can't, I know for certain that you can't prove that they were given a fair trial, especially given the fact that some of the accused were hit with double jeopardy. Zinoviev and Kamenev were already tried in 1935 and given 10 years. It is a violation of legal practices and legal rights to try them again for the same crime. Furthermore, executing them, and publicly at that, was completely unnecessary and only served to push internationally the narrative that the country was brutal. If you catch conspirators allegedly before they commit their crimes, you can put them in jail, but execution, especially such a swift one at that, these people were killed immediately after they received their convictions. That's just disgusting, man. Marxists also should be opposed to the death penalty. Let's see what Marx himself said about the death penalty. Punishment in general has been defended as a means of either ameliorating or of intimidating. Now, what right have you to punish me for the amelioration or intimidation of others? And besides, there is history. There is such a thing as statistics, which prove that with the most complete evidence that since Cain, the world has neither been intimidated nor ameliorated by punishment. Quite the contrary. From the point of view of abstract right, there is only one theory of punishment which recognizes human dignity in the abstract, and that is the theory of Kant, especially in the more rigid formula given to it by Hegel. Hegel says, punishment is the right of the criminal. It is an act of his own will. The violation of right has been proclaimed by the criminal as his own right. His crime is the negation of right. Punishment is the negation of this negation, and consequently, an affirmation of right, solicited and forced upon the criminal by himself. There is no doubt something specious in this formula, inasmuch as Hegel, instead of looking upon the criminal as the mere object, the slave of justice, elevates him to the position of a free and self-determined being. Looking, however, more closely into the matter, we discover that German idealism here, as in most other instances, has but given a transcendental sanction to the rules of existing society. Is it not a delusion to substitute for the individual with his real motives, with multifarious social circumstances pressing upon him, the abstraction of free will, one among the many qualities of man for himself? This theory, considering punishment as the result of the criminal's own will, is only a metaphysical expression for the old jus talionis, the right of retaliation by inflicting punishment of the same kind, eye against eye, tooth against tooth, blood against blood. Plainly speaking, and dispensing with all paraphrases, punishment is nothing but a means of society to defend itself against the infraction of its vital conditions. Now, what a state of society is that, which knows of no better instrument for its own defense than the hangman, and which proclaims through the leading journal of the world its own brutality as eternal law? Before I finish this video, there is something I feel that I need to stress. To suggest Trotsky and Hitler were willing to work together serves to completely downplay Hitler's anti-Semitism. You might say that is strange and improbable, but it happened. My friends, I don't and won't believe that it happened because you still have yet to give me any physical evidence. Words and essays don't mean anything. Show me the actual paper trail. If you can't do that, you can't be mad that people won't believe you. Now, Finnbol says that Hitler and Trotsky had no love for each other, but they shared a common interest. A statement like that makes perfect sense to describe the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It makes sense to describe Hitler's relationship with Mussolini. It makes sense to describe the Axis alliance as well as the Anglo-Soviet and American alliance following Operation Barbarossa. But to describe this sort of relationship between Hitler and a Jew, and not just any Jew, but the very Jew that helped to create the one thing Hitler sought to destroy more than anything. Finnbol can try all he wants to downplay Trotsky's role in the Russian Revolution, but he can't simply erase Trotsky from photos like the Soviets did. And besides, just look at the propaganda. Even if Finnbol doesn't believe that Trotsky was the architect of the Russian Revolution, everybody else did. Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitism was otherworldly. There was no room for Jews in Hitler's world. He hated the USSR and communism because he considered them to be Jewish. He literally screwed up his own nation's nuclear program because he considered the science to be Jewish science. All Nazi anti-Soviet propaganda revolved around its so-called Jewish nature. As Finnbol and everyone else knows, Hitler treated the war as if he was fighting in some holy fight to save Europe from so-called Judeo-Bolshevism. Now, all these people want us to believe against our better judgment that immediately after coming to power in Germany, that Hitler planned and had been planning to work with the literal avatar of so-called Judeo-Bolshevism, to say not only that Trotsky, but several dozen other Soviet Jewish communists were just going to completely disregard Hitler's anti-Semitism and were perfectly willing to work with him, not just at their own expense, but the expense of millions of Soviet citizens. And for what purpose? Just to overthrow their government because they lusted for power? And that's the reason, mentioned in the transcripts. You might say, it is not impossible for Jews to be fascists or Nazis. Certainly, I do not disagree. In Italy, one of Mussolini's first and biggest supporters was a Jewish banker. In Germany, we had the Association of National Jews, as well as several Jewish supporters of Otto Strasser. And in Palestine, we had Zev Jabotinsky, who felt himself to be a Jewish Mussolini and was even compared to Hitler by other Zionists. Even today, the specter of Jewish fascism is haunting the world currently. However, the pro-fascist Jew Ettore Ovaza was killed by the Nazis. And let us remember that in Palestine, there were actual Jewish fascist pro-Nazi Zionists who made repeated open overtures to Hitler to create an alliance so that he could undermine the British in the Middle East. And the Nazis completely ignored it. Why is it that Hitler was willing to work with Trotsky, but now with Stern, who actually had a terrorist network in Palestine? In Hakim's video on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, he states that the reason that the Polish state did not want to form a defense pact with the Soviets was because that they were anti-Semites. Although this defense pact would have been politically expedient and mutually beneficial for the Poles and the Soviets, in the same way that Hitler and Trotsky's supposed alliance was mutually beneficial, Hakim argues that it is because of the Poles' staunch anti-Semitism that they refused to accept Soviet help. Now, I am supposed to believe at the same time that it is perfectly plausible to believe that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not so strong that he was willing to work with Trotsky? Now, Finnbol is not Hakim, but I am certain that they share similar views regarding this matter. Now, I have finally reached the conclusion of this video. I hope that I have demonstrated that Finnbol's video does not definitively prove that the Moscow trials were not hoaxes, especially given that he barely talks about them. He does not scrutinize his sources and willingly hides the identity of some of them. Finnbol's video presents itself not as a good, well-researched video, but as an attempt at character assassination. It's political propaganda and not good history. All good Marxists must be proper historians. By putting out this shoddily researched video, Finnbol betrays himself as a Marxist. And to the many people who may have watched those videos, cited them, and sent them to their friends, I am genuinely disappointed in you. Now let me finish off with his last statement. Finnbol believes truly that the only reason most people deny the Moscow trials is because they have not read the court proceedings. I'll take Finnbol up on this claim. In my next few videos, I'll read the entire Moscow trials transcript, and you can all listen for yourselves. In fact, in the first section that I read, every time Trotsky's name is mentioned, I'm going to take a sip of a drink. And that's a bet.